Juliet, send in my 11:30. Yes, Dr. Winters. Pamela Winters sat back, tapping her pen on her steno pad, as Miss Janet Welch came through the door. She glanced around fearfully, looking at the small office as if expecting to see medieval torture devices. So many came into her office, expecting to see alchemic devices or sci-fi equipment, but Dr. Winters was a woman of science. She supposed, however, that when you call a place Dr. Winters' Forgetfulness Clinic, you had a certain expectation beyond a board-certified therapist in a cloudy gray pantsuit. Dr. Winters had 7, one for each day of the week, and Joanne kept them pressed for her, so they looked nice whenever she needed them. Joanne was a dear, and Pamela was lucky to have her. "So, Mrs. Welch," Dr. Winters began. "Oh, please, call me Janet. Everyone just calls me Janet." "Very well, Janet. What brings you into the clinic today?" "Well," Janet said, biting her lip as she seemed to rethink ever coming here, "something happened last week. Something I'd really like to forget." Dr. Winters smiled. "Well, that's why I'm here. Why don't you tell me about it?" Janet shuddered, looking around as if she thought something might be waiting to get her. She was clearly a runner. Her arms, and what she could see of her legs, looked tan and toned. She was wearing capri pants and a lovely blue sweater, her hair in a ponytail that seemed very comfortable to her. Her face, however, seemed anything but comfortable. Janet had clearly encountered something, and whatever it had been, it had rattled her badly. "Wait, don't you need to put me under or something? Hypnotize me? Put me in a receptive state?" Pamela smiled. "I certainly can if you like, but I don't have to. Can I offer you some tea? It's a special blend I make myself. It puts people at ease so they can tell me their problems." "I don't really," Janet began, but seemed to think better of it as she nodded. "On second thought, yeah, I'd love some." Dr. Winters got up and poured the tea from an ordinary-looking pot on a hot plate. As she brought the cup, Janet looked into the smoke before blowing on the liquid and taking a sip. She made an appreciative noise as she took another, the liquid steamy but not quite as hot as she had believed. She sat on the edge of the couch with her legs drawn up, looking like a child who's afraid to tell her parents that she's pregnant. Dr. Winters invited her to begin, and Janet told her of her strange experience in the woods. Janet stood upright from her stretch, filling her lungs with the crisp evening air. She loved early evening runs, the sun setting over her shoulder. As she began to jog through the parking lot, heading for the forest trail, she popped her earbuds in and hit play on her running playlist. Her sneakers sent up puffs of dust as she went from concrete to dirt, and Janet could hear the quiet evening conversation of birds and other small animals. They took to their heels when they saw her jogging towards them, and Janet saw a fat rabbit take off as it disappeared into the underbrush. She couldn't help but grin her Colgate whites at the cottontail. "That's right," she thought to the rabbit. "Make way for the apex predator." Janet jogged around the small pond and shivered a little as she saw the steam rising from the water. It was cold this evening, and the surface of the water looked glassy as she watched the fish dart about their simple lives. Did they know there was a world above their translucent home? They must, she thought, since so many of them were likely to remember at the end of a hook as they were dragged above. She rounded the corner of the pond and headed into the woods that made up the bulk of her run. She stopped suddenly, though, looking around as she jogged in place. She felt something she had never felt before. She had run here for years, almost every day since moving to the area, and had never felt anything like this. Something had noticed her that was higher on the food chain than she was, something that saw her as a meal. Janet shrugged it off as she took to the trails. There was nothing bigger than a deer out in these woods, the only exception being the black bears that sometimes moved out here. They were mostly cowards, choosing to run rather than attack people, but Janet had never seen one up close. More than likely, Janet was just feeling a little tense after the posters she'd seen on the way in, and she pushed herself as she took to the trail. Most people were on edge after the man had disappeared near here, but he'd just been a hiker. He'd gone missing on the trail several miles from here, but there was no proof that he wasn't still alive. The state park hiking trails linked up with the Appalachian Trail in a few places. Who was to say that he hadn't simply decided to extend his hike for several weeks? The fact that he'd told his wife that he was going out for a day hike seemed to refute this, but Janet put it out of her mind as the trees leaned crookedly over the path. The trails were miles from here, and Janet didn't feel like she was in danger, running on a public jogging path. As her jogging tunes kept her company, Brittany and Katy Perry pushing her on, Janet felt the woods close around her as she ran. She didn't feel uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of the trees. Quite the opposite. The trees were like arms that longed to hug, and Janet felt at ease the deeper on the trail she went. She had forgotten all about the weird feeling she'd felt before. Now she was back in her element, her strong legs taking her forward as her earbuds pumped her ears with the invigorating sound of her favorite exercise tunes. It began as a tickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of something akin to a sunburn, and Janet found herself turning to look at the woods as the trees whipped past. It made her uncomfortable, and Janet put her hand out to run over the spot on the back of her neck more than once. She'd thought at first that it might be a mosquito or a fly, but she never found anything as her fingers explored the space. She found her hands returning again and again as she ran, and it made the crawling feeling in her stomach feel worse over time. She had tried to shove discomfort down, but it became harder and harder to justify the deeper she went. Janet reminded herself that the trail was only 3 miles, and she was roughly a mile in. As long as she kept moving, she had little doubt that she could outdistance anything that might be following her. The path took her over a little bridge, and Janet stopped to look down at the water below as she covertly hit the pause button on her phone. The water was moving fast today, the little river sweeping the last of the fall leaves down with the current, and Janet let her eyes dart right and left as she swept the peripherals of her vision. She didn't dare remove her earbuds, wanting the illusion of being unable to hear what was chasing her. Something crunched in the woods to her left, and Janet had to stop herself from looking at it fretfully. Was it a deer? A squirrel? Maybe someone stalking her, getting ready to leap out and grab her? She couldn't see anything in that direction, but when something rustled the leaves from the other side of the path, the side she had yet to go running down, Janet let her fear get the better of her. She swung her head in that direction, seeing a monster amongst the late autumn leaves for half a heartbeat, only to realize that it was just a crow who had landed amongst them to root for breakfast. She laughed a little, feeling stupid as she realized that she'd let her paranoia get the better of her. The crow looked up curiously, startled by her laughter, and that made Janet laugh all the harder. Then, something broke behind her, and she turned in a panic as her laugh died on her lips. She slipped on the wet boards, the moss making them slick, and as she fell on her bottom, she saw something hunkered in the woods. It was dark, blending in with the afternoon shadows as the sun set, and in her fear she imagined that some great beast was on all fours. Its eyeless face was lost behind a black halo, its hands like scrabbling claws, and as she slipped on the slick boards, she could see it crawling towards her over the dead leaves and skeletal limbs that littered the forest floor. Janet slid backwards off the bridge, her feet finally finding purchase as she took off. She ran flat out, her terror high as she put as much distance between herself and whatever it had been as she could. Her rational mind tried to assert that it was probably just a dog or a small bear, but she was having none of it. She came to a fork, one way taking her towards the hiking trails and the other continuing on the running trail, and she took the right that would keep her on this trail. She was a mile in, but she couldn't turn around now. Whatever it had been was in that direction, and Janet knew that if she wanted to make it out, she needed to run away from it. She had run almost half a mile in a panic before her lungs started having trouble pulling in the cold air, and she doubled over on the trail. As she tried to keep from bringing up her lunch, she looked up at the sudden claustrophobic trees that gathered around her path. No longer did they seem in a hugging mood. As the sun set behind them, the shadows created angles where there had been none before. Janet could see the knobby fingers of skeletal hands. They were trying to grab her, to hold her down so the beast could get her, and Janet tried to remember how to make her lungs work again as she heard the sound she'd been dreading and spun in place. The sound of limbs cracking sent an icicle through her heart. A deer had stepped out onto the path, clearly feeling safer than her in the waning afternoon. It had a magnificent rack of antlers, the points glistening wetly as it looked at her distrustfully. To this thing, Janet was the predator, and Janet took a step back as she gave the bucket space. She wondered if this was what she had seen earlier. Maybe she had startled it as she ran like a crazy person through the woods. Maybe it had just been trying to crop a little grass when she had startled it. It ran suddenly, Janet watching it go, and that was when she saw it. It had been no bear after all, just a man in blue jeans and a black hoodie. The hoodie covered his face, leaving his features a murky guess at best. His jeans were stained with mud and dirt, and looked like they might stand up on their own if he took them off. He wore cheap tennis shoes that looked ready to fall apart, and they were muddy and stained up too much to tell their original color. He had noticed her noticing him, and when his hand came out of his front pocket, he was holding a large hunting knife. Janet suddenly remembered how to run, suddenly remembered how to pull air into her lungs, and screamed as she pelted off into the woods. She had lost her reason. She had no sense of where she was going. She only knew that wherever it was away from this man with the knife. She ran into the woods, the trees grabbing at her as their knobby branches scratched her arms and face. They tried to grab her clothes, but the expensive jogging gear was tight against her skin, and the clutching limbs slid off her. She kept looking behind her, trying to see if the man was following her, but it was early twilight, and she couldn't see much. The sun would be down in about 20 minutes, and then she would be at the mercy of the woods by night. She had run this path 1,000 times, thought she knew the woods so well, but now she was hopelessly lost, running for her life. She chanced to look behind her, and turned back in time to feel the root grab her foot. She fell against the tree, knocking the wind out of herself as she went down amidst the dirt and leaves. Her frantic feet churned up the ground, rolling her over and giving her a great view of the man as he stalked in, knife at the ready. "Please," she wheezed out, her breath still gone. "Please." She tried again, but she couldn't make anything come out. Too winded to even beg for her life. How pathetic she must seem. So much for being an apex predator. The real predator had found her as she went about her day, and now meant to gobble her up. She could see the bottom of his mouth as a wide smile grew from it. He was stalking in, the knife still held down at his side, and as she wiggled left to try to juke around him, he jumped to match her. It was all a game to him, an enjoyable distraction, and now it was over. Now he meant to have his prize, whatever that might be. As he loomed over her, pulling the knife back for a stab, Janet closed her eyes and prayed that he would just kill her and not decide to stretch out her terror. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, Janet wanting him to get on with it, when he sighed in ecstasy. She felt something patter against her face, warm and thick, but cooling quickly as it dappled her cheeks and eyelids. She felt sick, her fear realized, but when she opened her eyes to peek, her left eye was covered in a film of red. The man stood over her, his hoodie now sporting 3 long rips in the chest as something pushed its way out. He had bled on her, his grin fading as he gasped out the last of his life. The knife fell from his limp fingers, sticking in the ground blade first, and as his legs tried to give way, he was pulled backwards by something much larger. The sun was setting behind the thing as it crouched amongst the trees, and Janet had to put a shaky hand up to see the creature. It looked like a toad, a massive toad with granite green skin perched on its bottom as it drew the man towards it. It towered amongst the trees, 15 or 16 feet high, its arms long and spindly, its fingers tipped with cruel claws. It brought the man back to look him in the eye, smiling as it saw the fear that it wanted. The man was seizing, shaking as the blood dripped down those long claws, and when the creature leaned forward, Janet could see its mouth was full of similarly jagged teeth. The crunch when it bit the man's arm off was accentuated by his wheezy scream as he shook violently. It ate his other arm, grinning as the blood ran and the hooded man cried out pitifully. Janet could only watch as the legs came off next, the creature finally ending the man's sobbing as it slid the dribbling torso into its mouth and crunched with relish. It was licking its fingers when it finally noticed Janet, and its smile was no less frightening as its piss-yellow eyes fastened on her. "Don't worry," it said, its voice like angry bees caught in a jar. "I have no intention of eating you." It slithered in, its body elongating as it drew close to Janet. She could tell now that it had been hunching before, its body much bigger than she had thought, and the knowledge did little to quell her fear. Its face came right up until it blocked out the sun, those horrible teeth almost hypnotizing her as they stared right through her. Janet felt her bladder let go, her running pants holding the liquid in as they held her sweat so many times before. She thought it would lie, thought it would eat her anyway, but instead it just whispered to her in that hissy little voice, telling her what she had known all along, but never wanted to hear. "I only eat predators, only desire the taste of those that have taken lives and reveled in their end. You, my dear, are no killer. Hop back to your warren, little rabbit. A true hunter moves among these woods." Janet closed her eyes, the tears and snot running down her face in rivulets, and when she opened them again, she was alone. After that, I got up and managed to find the path before it got too dark. I walked the path, expecting that thing would get me any minute, but instead I made it back to my car. I drove home and sat in the car till my husband came to ask if I was okay. I couldn't tell him about the creature or the man. I just told him that something had spooked me in the woods. "I've dreamed about that creature every night, though," she said, her tears falling into her cup as she looked into her reflection. "I haven't run since. Something I love that helps me deal with stress like this, and I don't know if I ever will again." Dr. Winters nodded. "You had a very traumatic experience, but," and when she said the word, she saw Janet tense as if someone's hand had tightened a piano wire in her spine. "I think anyone would be a little rattled if they were the victim of a bear attack." A bear attack?" Janet said almost dreamily. "Yes, just as you told me. You were running and came upon a mother bear and her cubs. Black bears don't usually hurt people, but she was just protecting her babies. She chased you away and you ran, scared out of your mind, as anyone would be. You ran all the way to your car and then drove home. Your mind has made quite a lot of it, but if you're careful, you probably won't find yourself the target of a mother bear again." Janet's face was slack, her mind reeling as it mulled over this new information. Dr. Winters wrinkled her nose as Janet's mouth opened and the tea spilled back into the cup. This was her least favorite part of the exercise, but it was necessary. "That's right. It's just a bear and her cubs. Poor old thing. I never even stopped to think of it like that. Thank you, Dr. Winters. I feel much better now." Dr. Winters smiled. "That's the idea, my dear. I help my clients put things into perspective. I help them forget their fears and remember that nothing was really as bad as they remember." Janet got up, handing Dr. Winters her cup. She looked about 1,000 times calmer than she had when she came in. This was the woman who'd gone running in the woods, Winters saw. This was the woman whose worldview had been shaken by her encounter with something far older and far darker than a mother bear and her whelps. Janet had seen something few people walked away from, and she was lucky to be alive. She would never know how lucky she was, but that, too, was the idea. Dr. Winter waited for the door to snick closed before taking the cup to the sink where she kept the small green fish net. This part was delicate, and She didn't want to lose it. Reaching into the cabinet over the sink, she took out a mason jar and set it in the drain before beginning. You only lost a few of them down the sink before you got smart about it. Tipping the cup over the net, Dr. Winter poured out the tea and strained the liquid, looking for the memory. The cup was heavier than it had been when it was full, and Winter just knew there would be something juicy at the bottom. It joggled as she tipped the cup over, and a large white rubbery thing fell into the net with a wet slap. It was a little smaller than a fist, the center glowing a little as it winked like a firefly. Winter tipped it into the jar, pouring some tea on top of it before she put the lid on, lifting it up to have a look. It was like ice as it floated at the midpoint, and if Dr. Winter looked closely, she could see the horrific face of the creature as it got in Janet's face and delivered its terrible proclamation. Dr. Winter smiled as she put the jar in the cupboard, several other colorful balls of semi-liquid winking in the dark space. Another satisfied customer. Dr. Pamela Winters found the man in her office when she returned from lunch. This wasn't uncommon. Juliet often let her clients in to wait. But the man in the cast-off clothes who was sitting across from her desk wasn't one of Dr. Winters' usual patients. He was young, 20 or 21, and had a vacant look about him that made her think that he might have recently been in an accident. She expected him to be dim, his speech slurred or hurried, but as he explained himself, she could almost hear the money that had gone into his education. He may have looked like a bum, but he spoke like a Harvard grad. "I do hope you'll excuse me for barging in without an appointment, but I really need your help." "I'd be glad to help you with whatever it is you have going on. If you'll step back out into the waiting room and fill out a few forms so we can..." He cut her off with a look that made her rethink her earlier assessment. The look had been cold, calculating, and was clearly something that the now smiling youth had been unaware that he'd done. "That may be difficult," he said after a few confused seconds, "since I can't remember who I am." Dr. Winters blinked, confused as to what he thought she could do. She'd helped people with their problems, true, but how did she help someone who doesn't know what his problem is? Also, this was a clinic for forgetting, and Winter had never helped anyone try to remember. "Interesting. You do realize this is a forgetfulness clinic?" The man shrugged. "Well, if you can make me forget, then remembering shouldn't be that hard, should it?" Winter nodded, putting her back to the man as she fixed tea in a nearby alcove. "I hate to be that person, but this isn't exactly a charity. Without insurance, or even a name, how do you intend to pay for your session today?" "Please," he said, almost begging, "I have no memory before the day before yesterday when I woke up in a hospital bed. Someone had found me beside a road in the mountains with no identification. All I have are these flashes of something dark, and I feel like if I don't find out what they are, then something terrible may happen. When I saw you on television this morning, I knew you could help me. You've helped so many, and I just know that you can help me discover who I am and why I went to the mountains." Winter almost rolled her eyes. That damn television slot. She had fought against the idea for months before Jessica Parker, the host of Celebrities in Our Neighborhood for the local 9, had finally convinced her to be on the show. What had followed was an hour of having her craft put on public display for every yahoo with a basic cable package. Winter told them about the work she'd done through regression, helping patients through their trauma, through forgetfulness, about her practice, and where potential clients could find her. The conversation inevitably turned to Megan Birch, the amnesia victim whose identity was resolved after 3 weeks of sessions with Winter, which was doubtless what had brought this fellow here today. Megan Birch had been good for business, but now it appeared that Winter would have to deal with these sorts of people now that she was famous. When her parents had brought her in, Winter hadn't known what she could do for the girl. They had found her unconscious behind the house, and after taking her to the hospital, it was discovered that she had amnesia. They had brought her to Winter after a long string of doctors that could do little to help her memory loss. Her mother, having read about Dr. Winter's Forgetfulness clinic in the paper, had thought maybe she could do something. Winter had, indeed, done something, and Matthew Birch, the governor's right-hand man, had discovered that his brother had been using the shed on the edge of his property to hide drugs with the intent to sell. Megan had seen him there, and he'd chased and caught her before slamming her head against a tree and knocking her unconscious. Winter had spent some time untangling the memories, and when Megan had told her father what he'd seen, he'd gone to the police, and his brother had admitted the whole thing. He had turned out to be running drugs for a motorcycle gang to pay off a gambling debt, since no one would expect the brother of such an important person to be on their payroll. Now, Winter was a local celebrity for helping the family and bringing the girl's uncle to justice. Now, it appeared, Winter would have to deal with horse crap like this from everyone who thinks she can untangle their memories. "I suppose we can try," she said, passing him a cup of steaming tea. "Take this. I find it helps when remembering." The man looked at the tea and smirked. "Ginseng?" he asked as he took a sip. "Winter cherry," Winter corrected, "among other things. Now I want you to close your eyes and focus on something you can remember. It could be anything. A smell, a taste, a sound, a picture, just something to anchor you to your last memory." The man closed his eyes and screwed up his face, trying to remember things that he had forgotten. After a few minutes, he peeked a little, smiling mischievously. "I'm not really coming up with anything." Winter sighed, checking her watch before trying to think of a solution. She had an appointment in 45 minutes, a client that she couldn't turn away. This guy's story was interesting, but these sessions could take hours, and she just didn't have the time to give. He closed his eyes again, almost strained as he tried to remember, but Winter had already decided to tell him to make an appointment with Juliet. He would make it, not show up, and then her time would stop being wasted. "I remember eyes." Winter looked back, her thoughts a little lost. Eyes? His eyes were closed, his face slack and at ease, but beneath his lids, Winter thought she could see his eyes jittering frantically. They were round, like two moons, with a dark pit in their middle. They're staring at me from a place, a dark place. As I watch, they get closer and closer, swimming up towards me until I smell something burning and blink. His eyes scrunched up in confusion, but when he took another sip of tea, Winter knew he wasn't completely gone. Drinking it was fine, but most of what she wanted was the steam. It would waft the scent in his face, forcing him to remember what he'd forgotten as it clouded his mind with the combination of winter cherry, ginseng, and something else that might remind him of burning. "I remember smelling something burning." He was young, he believed. He remembered chairs being below eye level, and guessed he might have been 4 or 5. Something was burning, and he followed the smell into the kitchen. It was dinner. Dinner was burning. Smoke was billowing out of the oven, but that wasn't the worst thing waiting in the kitchen. He could see the woman laying as she was bleeding on the marble floor, dressed in a plain gray servant's uniform that was getting ruined by the blood leaking out of her head. A small wire had been strung across the entrance, and from the stain on the edge of the island, it seemed that she had fallen and hit her head. As other servants came running in, he heard a snicker from the edge of the doorway, just out of sight as he peeked at the chaos. He turned to see a boy crouching there. A boy he recognized, though it gave him an odd sense of vertigo to look at him. When he looked at him, the boy realized he knew the other, and as he blacked out, he took his realization with him. "How do you know him?" Winter asked. "Is he a friend of yours?" "He was me," the man almost whispered. "But when he turned to look at me, he had yellow eyes, like the ones I saw looking out from the darkness. I blacked out after I saw him, and I can't remember anything after that." Dr. Winter drank her own tea, taken off guard by what she was hearing. Was he schizophrenic? Did he have a twin? Was this some sort of repression? An out-of-body experience? Winter really hoped he was just telling her about a dream he'd had, or was maybe making things up and he'd slip at some point. "What else do you remember?" Winter asked, watching him as his eyes jittered behind his lids. She was a little afraid he might drop the cup in his theatrics before he took another small sip. "There's a smoky smell. Something's on fire." He was looking up at the treehouse, the smoke billowing out in thick black clouds. He was holding something in his hand, the plastic warm against his fingers, and he looked down to see a lighter held in his childish hands. Had he done this? Had he lit the treehouse on fire? He tossed the lighter away, not wanting to touch it, and that's when he noticed the boy beside him. The boy he knew was him. When the yellow-eyed boy looked at him, he could see that he was holding something too. It was a penknife, and the remains of a rope ladder. "Harold!" He looked up and could see 3 sooty faces looking down to the little square in the floor of the wooden house. Their eyes looked like horses' eyes when they've smelled a fire in the field. They were unsure, their mortality at hand before their time. They called to him, calling him Harold, and as they yelled down, he saw the yellow-eyed boy grinning like a maniac. He reveled in their pain, wallowed in their fear, and he felt himself shaking in fear. "Help us, Harold! Go get help!" someone screamed, and he looked up in time to see someone falling out of the square and hitting the ground. He could tell by the sound of the fall that they had broken something. They groaned as they lay there, their leg visibly broken as the bone jutted from the skin. They reached up for him, trying to get his help, but the hand came towards the yellow-eyed boy instead. The boy grinned at him, drinking in his suffering, before turning and stalking off into the woods. They called after him, wanting his help, but he ignored them. Winter didn't get the cold chill that she often read in these stories like this. The man was admitting to murdering other children, but it was a little too theatrical for her. He opened his eyes, looking for all the world like a scared rabbit that's just discovered a fox den under his burrow. "That's the first time I've heard any kind of name associated with me since I woke up. I'm a little scared though, Doc. Are these real memories? Did I do these things?" Winter shrugged. "Who's to say? Memories are never concrete, and many of them are tainted by the time in which we lived them. Does the name help your recollection?" He closed his eyes, and Winter was a little put off by the way his eyes jittered again. It was unnatural. She'd seen people relive their memories before, but this was different. She felt as if she could almost see those eyes behind the lids, and if she could see them, Winter wondered if it would be the same yellow eyes the man kept talking about. Each memory seems to start with the smell of something burning. Now that I've seen one, the things I remember all seem to have that in common. "Do you have another?" Winter asked, pursing her lips as she watched the cup in his hand. Something wasn't right. This wasn't how it usually worked. "I remember smelling something burning just before a fire. Burning, and the smell of gasoline." The scarf had gone up like a bonfire, catching the bookshelf with little effort. The scarf had been soaked in gasoline, and it had irritated his skin as he wore it. Well, not Harold. Harold had never worn it. It had been the other, the yellow-eyed man. No longer a boy, they both now sat on the couch in a cluttered apartment. The couch was squashy, the springs poking Harold as he sat next to her. She was the wall between the two, the thing that separated them, though she wasn't very good at it. She was laying against the back of the couch, her head pillowed against the cushion as her mouth hung open bonelessly. Her eyes stared endlessly up towards the popcorn ceiling, taking it all in without blinking as the two men watched her. If there wasn't a syringe sticking out of her chest, she could have almost been napping. As the bonfire raged behind him, Harold got a good look at the man. He looked just like him. They could have been twins, but those eyes seemed to bore into his soul. They stared into his, the grin on his face looking absolutely insidious. He wanted to leave, wanted to flee before the fire could consume them both, but he was utterly unable to move. The two stared at each other, his vision swimming as the smoke stung his eyes, and when he blinked, he passed out. Winter sipped her tea, thinking about what he'd told her. She thought she might remember that one. A college student who had been burned to death in her dorm room. It had been very sad, but there was some who'd questioned it. The police had suspected that it might have been a murderer, trace amounts of accelerant found at the scene, but no one quite believed it. It was dropped after a few months, and nothing ever came of it. It seemed Harold here might know more than he was letting on. "How old were you when this happened?" she asked, making notes so she'd have something to give to the police later. Patient confidentiality only went so far. "I believe I was in college. I remember her a little. I think we had classes together, but I'm not absolutely certain." He still had his eyes closed as they jittered, Dr. Winters trying to ignore them. There was a lump forming in his throat as he spoke, his voice croaking as he tried to push it out. It bulged like a grotesque Adam's apple, rising and falling as he tried to get it out, and she knew that whatever was keeping his memories was coming to the surface. "Tell me about the yellow-eyed man. He seems to revel in fires. The more I smell the smoke, the more I remember the times he appeared to do something wrong. I'm not sure if he's me or just looks like me, but he's doing these things in spite of my wishes, and I don't know what it means." He snorted suddenly, swallowing whatever was in his throat, and Winter wrinkled her nose. "What else do you remember?" Dr. Winter asked, getting up and crossing to the young man. His hair was greasy, but relatively clean, she reflected, as she rested her hand on it. He looked up at her as she began to work her fingers against his scalp, stroking the gray matter below as she tried to coax the memories out. "They say all that gray up there has no feeling," but as she stroked at the skin, she could hear the screams that vibrated through her fingertips, and could swear they were from that pulsing slush between his ears. Harold was in trouble. The yellow-eyed man, that leering boogeyman from his past, had killed another girl. He had sliced her up, and now Harold was running through the park, the police in hot pursuit. He had woken up in the park, the smell of a fire bringing him around as the logs burned low. Harold wasn't sure how he'd come to be here. He had fallen asleep in his dorm around noon, so he'd be fresh for his evening classes. But now he was in the park, sitting around the remains of an evening picnic. The checkered blanket he always used was set up, as was the wicker basket he often filled with food. The remains of the food sat around him, ants already moving in on the crumbs. But the blanket was stained with blood, as was the young woman leaning half in the bush next to the blanket. Harold looked at her, her head having painted the bush red after someone had smashed it with something. Harold had turned to throw up, not wanting to puke on the poor girl, and that was when the patrolman had come upon them. He likely thought he had found a little love nest, but as the flashlight fell on Harold, he saw someone else standing in the bush not too far away. The flashlight fell on the yellow-eyed man, the wine bottle in his hand still dripping blood, as he disappeared into the bushes. Harold had run after him, ignoring the police as they yelled at him to stop. He wanted to catch him, wanted to stop him, otherwise these officers would think that he had been the one to perpetrate these crimes. He got closer as he ran, gaining on the man as he tried to outrun him. He got close enough to grab his waistband, and when he did, he yanked him sideways before jumping onto him and rolling him into a nearby bush. The two lay amidst the scrub bushes, face to face, as the yellow-eyed man leered at him knowingly. His bottle was gone, but Harold knew that he was still very dangerous. He thought about hitting him, about pummeling him into a pulp, but as he heard the policeman approaching, he closed his eyes and became very still instead. He could hold him, he told himself, and if they found them, then he could say that he had caught the murderer. If they didn't, well, Harold would still have him. They looked around for a few minutes before heading off, and when Harold opened his eyes, the yellow-eyed man was gone. He disappeared, wiggled free as I lay there. I don't know how he managed it, but his next words were a whimpered cry of agony. As he spoke, Winter had felt a twinge of something familiar beneath the surface, and so much of his story began to make sense. Her fingers flexed against his skull, her fingers feeling out the knots as she worked through the trauma, looking for something that could affirm her suspicions. He jittered a little, his eyes rolling up as they rumbled behind his eyelids. The yellow-eyed man grinned as he slunk out of Harold's dorm room, leaving a woman in his bed with her throat cut, the candles burning out on his nightstand. Harold chased the yellow-eyed man as he left a jogger behind on the trail, a cigarette smoldering in the grass. Harold was leaving his car in the middle of the road as he came to in the front seat, a dead body in the back, the smoke from the dented hood bringing him around. Winter growled a little, wanting to skip ahead, but it seemed like the wiring was off in Harold's head. He was a mess, his memories stumbling ahead from one moment to the next, and Winter became fairly certain his current state had something to do with this yellow-eyed creature. She fumbled through the flashes, picking up very little other than Harold's torments at the hands of this person, until she came to the end. Harold was shuddering as her fingers stopped their rifling, and his body sagged backwards in total relaxation. The girl, Megan Birch, had cried out as she finally came to the heart of the problem, so Winter had expected the same response. An almost orgasmic level of relaxation hadn't been it, but Winter would take what she could get. There was a real appointment sitting in the waiting room who would want to occupy that couch in 15 minutes, and unlike Harold Fortray, their bill was paid. "Tell me about the night your father called you to his office," she commanded, no longer intrigued by the mystery. "I was home on a break," he intoned, his words sounding like a sleepwalker's. "School was out for winter break, but I'd been home for a week before that." The paper had crumbled in his father's hand, the flames licking at it as the Zippo lit it aflame. He dropped it into the metal garbage can in his office, his eyes boring into Harold. Harold couldn't help but shudder as the smoke curled up from the can. The paper had been his father's will, the one that left everything to Harold when he died. "Why would you do that?" Harold had asked, the smoke rising from the can to tickle against his nose. "Because, Harold, I'm tired of cleaning up after your messes. Ever since you were a boy, I've had to clean up after you. I told myself that this was just a misunderstanding, that this was something you'd work out somehow, but I see now that isn't the case. After this girl they've found in your dorm room, I can't keep making excuses for you. I'm disowning you, Harold. You need help, but you're not going to get it at the ruination of me." The smoke curled up around his nostrils as the bundle of paper burned, and Harold felt himself sneeze. If his father noticed the change in his eyes when he opened them again, he didn't mention it. "You have until morning to leave the estate. You may take your things and your car, but that is all. You will forfeit any company stocks you have and give up any claim to the Forte name. From now on, you'll—" But he never finished. As Harold wrapped his hands around his father's throat, he found the words choked out. He watched his father's face turn ashen, then blue, then purple, and just as he was sure the old man would stop thrashing and trying to pry his fingers off, something hit the back of his head, and Harold fell down. He rolled his head around to look at the butler, who had worked in the house since before he was born, and passed out as the man looked down at him with a mask of fear and accomplishment. Winter released his head, letting it flop down as she took a few steps back. "Cute. The butler did it," she said, waiting for what she knew was coming next. "Then they dressed you in cast-off clothes and dumped you somewhere, hoping you were dead or had a concussion and wouldn't come back. The police would find you with no ID, and it would take you years to figure out who you were. I'm guessing when they bonked you, it screwed up your ability to get at this kid, didn't it?" The head came up slowly, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled by a skilled hand, and when his eyes came open, Winter was unsurprised to see that they were piss yellow. The veins in them stood out like an accusation. The corneas all but gone amidst the wash of yellow, and he grinned as he watched her. When he didn't receive the look of shock and horror that he'd been expecting, it seemed to confuse him, but he hid it well. "Quite astute for one of your kind," it fumbled, rising from the couch and taking a step towards her. "I suppose as thanks for helping me with this problem, I'll give you the honor of being another notch on my belt." He held the teacup up like a club, but when he looked at Winter, he took a step back in surprise. Winter didn't know what he saw in her eyes as she smirked at him, but it had certainly put some apprehension into his pissy orbs. "Oh, sweetie, you're so far out of your element that it isn't even funny. You're late in learning one of the great cosmic truths, but you'll have plenty of time to learn it when you return to whatever stinking pit birthed you. There's always a bigger fish." "Good afternoon, Mr. Fortray. This is Dr. Pamela Winters of Kashmir. I'm calling to let you know that I've found your son, Harold Fortray. He's told me a very interesting story and admitted to a lot of things. A lot of very interesting things that the police might be very interested in." Winter smiled as the pompous jagoff started blustering, watching Harold snore as he lay on the couch. He looked so peaceful now, so weightless without all those secrets to weigh him down. He slept like a baby as his father blustered and rattled on the other end, but Winters had expected it. "No, sir. When I make a threat, you'll know it. If you'll let me continue, patient confidentiality finds me quite unable to tell the police anything we've discussed here. I've even fixed that troublesome little problem he's had." "How?" She smiled hugely, her white teeth gleaming in the harsh fluorescence of her office. "Mr. Fortray, making people forget is my job. He's quite cured now, and if he isn't, I'm sure you'll tell everyone who will listen what a shyster I am and run me out of town. You can come pick him up, take your heir back as bright and quick as he was before he went looking into the wrong holes as a child, but there's the matter of his bill." She listened a little more, nodding as Fortray's tone changed from skeptical to something like disbelief. They often thought it was too good to be true, and he would surely want to come look his gift horse in the mouth and inspect its teeth. "Come have a look at him, take him home, and if he exhibits any strange behavior, I'll give you my private cell so you can call me, day or night. I don't believe that will be a problem, though." She listened to the old man a while longer, smiling as she listened to the thing she had yanked out of Harold rattle in the cabinet. "I'm very thorough, and forgetting is what we do here at this clinic." "I just don't think I can live with this. I need it gone, or it'll drive me to drink." Dr. Winter tapped the edge of a spoon against the teacup, and the sound it made was like a clarion bell. She brought the cup over to the man sitting across from her, taking him in with a studied glance. He was different than her usual clientele. The man looked as if his demons were far behind him, all save this one thing that he couldn't quite exorcise. He wore a crisp, white button-up shirt. He was clean-shaven, and looked as though he had a handle on his life. He looked as though he ran most mornings, perhaps hit the gym for more than 3 months out of the year, and other than his eyes, which roved like a scared horse's, he seemed very well put together. That was likely a smokescreen for the problems that lay just beneath the surface. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Turner?" "It was something that happened almost 10 years ago," Mr. Turner said, taking a sip of his tea. "Ooh, that's good. I was wrapped up in something with someone who was very close to me, someone I thought of as a brother. We'd been through a lot, but we couldn't both make it out of this one, it seemed. Why don't you tell me all about it? Sometimes talking about it is the best way to get it off your chest." Mr. Turner nodded, taking another sip of tea, before letting the cup sit under his nose as he contemplated. I guess it all started with Tommy. I'm an alcoholic. Just because I haven't had a drink in 10 years doesn't change the fact. They say in AA that once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic. It's just a matter of time before you either slip up or you die. Well, I guess I'm waiting for eternity, because I'll never take a drink again for as long as I live. Not after what I saw. Me and Tommy, we were in the service together. We met in the Army, crawled through the sandbox together for years, and I don't know very many of them that didn't come out of that war zone with a burgeoning drinking problem. There weren't a lot of help for guys like us when we got back stateside, so we did our jobs, lived rough more often than not, and capped off most nights with a bottle of something cheap and strong. We'd been stateside for about 5 years when the scare happened. Tommy was wandering around one night, blitzed out of his gourd, when a city bus hit him. The ER doc said that if he hadn't been drunk, he'd probably be dead. I knew that if Tommy weren't drunk, he'd have had no reason to wander into the street in the first place. He broke his arm, broke a bunch of ribs, fractured his skull, but he seemed like he was going to make a real recovery. He didn't have insurance, didn't have money either, and the city didn't look like they wanted to take responsibility for him wandering drunk into the street and getting hit. The city lawyer said they'd make a deal, a one-time thing. They would pay his medical bills, give him a one-time settlement of about 20 grand, but only if he completed an Alcoholics Anonymous program. The city council wants to look like they're doing something about the drunk and homeless problem. You just happen to cover both of those bases. So they've offered you a deal. You complete the program, look good for the cameras, and give them a feel-good piece that they can use to show the mayor that they're doing right. And they cut you a check and send you on your way. What you do after that is up to you, but I'd suggest not wandering in front of any more city buses. Tommy thought it sounded like a great idea, and I decided to start AA with him. The whole thing had been a wake-up call, and I knew that it could have just as easily been me out in front of that bus. I thought it might help if he had someone to go through it with, too, and Tommy swore that once he got the money, he'd help make both our lives better. I won't forget you, Derek. You helped me come out on the other side of this, and I'll help us both get back on our feet. So, we joined AA together. For the first 3 months, it was fine. They don't tell you when you get started, but alcohol is one of the hardest drugs to kick. I know that sounds weird, given you can buy it anywhere, but it is a drug. Don't misunderstand. Tommy and I spent the first couple of weeks shaking on the couch together, going through the DTs with a handful of pills they gave us at the free clinic. The city had put us in a cheap apartment, mostly so they could do well checks on Tommy, and we were happy for a place to stay that was out of the rain. For 2 months, it rained just about every other day in the city, and that was the other thing that made sobriety so bad. If we'd been able to walk around, roam the roads, we'd probably been a lot better. Cooped up in that apartment was hell. We had cleaned out all our hooch, and Tommy wandered around like an angry ghost. I hadn't started drinking seriously until my second year in the Army, but Tommy had apparently been drinking since he was 9. His dad was a real piece of shit, kind of guy that likes to tie on a half a dozen and come home and beat his kids as a warm-up before he really lays into his wife. Tommy fell into the bottle hard from a young age, and we've had screaming matches in the floor of that apartment as I held him down and refused to let him go till he finally passed out. In that respect, the meetings helped a little. The meetings were an excuse to leave the house, and they were something that Tommy and I looked forward to every day. The city only wanted us to go to one a day, but Tommy and I always went to both. The noonday meeting was the best, mostly because you could count on getting fed. The evening meetings were good too, but I had to watch Tommy because there was always a chance of him trying to sneak off to a bar we knew of a couple of blocks over. Tommy wanted to be sober. He told me so, but his brain hadn't quite figured it out yet. I caught him drinking Listerine more than once, and one night I had to rush him to the ER when he drank a half a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He was always apologetic afterwards, swearing that he'd never do it again, but I think we both knew Tommy was a relapse waiting to happen. He didn't relapse for 6 months, but when he did, he relapsed hard. We were sitting at an AA meeting around noon, listening to some guy talk about how he'd stolen money from his sister because he'd spent his paycheck that he'd just gotten on booze, when Tommy suddenly stood up and walked to the coffee pot. I figured he just wanted more Joe, but when I looked back, he was gone. I looked for him, but he was nowhere to be found. I called his sponsor, telling him to keep an eye out for him, and went home to wait. All the while, as I paced and worried, this needling little voice in the back of my head tried to get me to go look for him. It told me just where I'd find him, but I squashed it. I knew what it wanted, knew where it wanted me to go look for him, and I knew where that would lead me. It wanted the same thing for 6 months. It wanted me to go look at a bar, but not for Tommy, for my first drink. I sat in the apartment and watched TV instead, and that was where I was when the Broken Stool called me. The Broken Stool was a dive bar, plain and simple. It was a kind of place that guys like me and Tommy went when money was tight. We could drink their watered-down booze for damn near nothing. The bar owner was a lifetime alcoholic, too. Sometimes he'd give us drinks just 'cause he knew what the DTs were like. He knew it all too well. I guarantee you that half of that guy's stock probably went down his own throat. I should have known Tommy would go there. Tommy had gone out to get smashed, and if you weren't in funds, the Broken Stool was the best place to do it. Derek, your buddy's down here, and I've had to cut him off. He's drunk up near $500 a hooch, and I'm beginning to suspect that he doesn't have the money to pay his tab. Tommy's a friend, D. If it were anyone else, I'd have tossed him out on his ass and called the cops. Since it's Tommy, I'm calling you, so come down here and be a friend. I hung up the phone, thinking that if Lenny was so worried about friendship, he probably shouldn't have served a recovering alcoholic $500 worth of camel piss. I went and got Tommy, paid his bill, took him home, and called his sponsor. The next day, a representative from the council was at our door, and he didn't look too happy. Tommy told him it was just a relapse. It was just a little slip-up. He was sorry. It wouldn't happen again, and he hated that he'd had to come all the way down here for nothing. The man took it well enough and left to get back to whatever qualified as work for those guys. Tommy was good for 3 months. Then he relapsed again. This time, however, it wasn't so private. Tommy got drunk and wandered into a nearby park where he proceeded to take a dump in the kids' playground. That might have been easily covered up, except the playground was full of tykes and it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I came to get Tommy from the police station that time, and the smell of him made me want to relapse. That's a hard thing to say, but the man smelled enough like a distillery that I wanted a drink. You know you've been drinking too long when you can pick out the individual flavors on a man's breath. Thunderbird, Mad Dog, Honey Bee, all the old friends from days gone by. The ones that cost about $3 a bottle and are gone in about 30 seconds. The city'd been using Tommy as a success story, but now it was going to be hard to do after a very public relapse. The same guy as last time came back, but this time he wasn't smiling. We realized that AA may not be for everyone, so we found you a new program. A program with 100% success rate. I asked him how that could be, and he said the program was just that good. They have never failed to cure someone of their alcoholism. It's called the Burbank program, and I've signed Tommy up to start tomorrow. I asked him if it was something we could do together, but the man said it was very exclusive and more than a little experimental. This is your last chance, Thomas. Otherwise, you'll be back on the street, and you'll have to pay for your own rehabilitation and your own recovery. Tommy was excited. He said if this place could get him off the bottle, then he'd do it. I took the bus with him to the address, and it turned out to be a big old office building. The program was sponsored by a brewery, kind of a give-back sort of outfit, and I watched Tommy walk in before I headed off to my morning AA meeting. Came back around noon to find him sitting on the couch with a bottle of strange liquid and a placid look stretched across his face. I was pissed. I asked him what he thought he was doing, but he told me it was part of the program. I asked him to tell me about it, and in between swigs he did. That's great, Derek. They gave me this bottle and they tell me to drink as much as I want. It tastes terrible, but it always refills itself, and it kind of keeps you sociably drunk. It won't get you falling down drunk, but it keeps you buzzed, and it always refills itself. Did I mention that last part? 'Cause it's kind of important. Tommy kept on drinking from the bottle, and as long as he had it, he never went back to the hard stuff. The man from the city was happy. Tommy was happy. And I had to admit that I was kind of glad that I didn't have to fight him every night to get him to not go to the bars. It seemed like a great solution, but I guess it couldn't last forever. About 6 months into the program, Tommy comes home and says they want him to give up the bottle. Some of the other guys in the program have already done it, but most of us don't want to give it up. It's stupid. Why should we give up something that makes us feel good? I could think of a couple of reasons, and I told him as much. Tommy might be enjoying himself, but he looked terrible. He was pale, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. I would have suspected that he was on a several days bender, but I knew he'd done nothing but drink habitually from that bottle he carried. I had asked him to see it a few times, but he always got very nervous and refused to let go of it. The bottle was his obsession, his worry stone, and the longer he kept it, the more he seemed to cling to it. AA had really helped me, but when I suggested that maybe he could go back, he scoffed. Why would I? I got everything I need right here. I didn't claim to be an expert, but I'd heard enough stories to know when someone's circling the drain. A couple weeks after that, I came home to find Tommy crying on the couch. It's Larry. He disappeared. He never showed up to group today, and we checked everywhere for him. He's just gone. He took a long pull from the bottle, and I waited for him to finish before asking him what he was talking about. Turned out Larry was someone from the program, someone who also didn't want to give up the bottle. When Tommy and his friends told the director of the program that Larry was missing, they didn't seem too surprised. They said that people sometimes left the program for different reasons, and that Larry had probably realized he had gotten everything from the program that he could, and left to live his life. Tommy said that, yeah, that's how many of them did it, but they always said goodbye first and had a little graduation ceremony. They continued to look, but when Cecil went missing, Tommy got scared. Cecil was another one from the back of the room club, as we used to call it in AA. The kind of guys who sit in the back row so you don't smell the stale booze on them. The kind of guys who joke and cut up and don't make it a year and eventually drop off. In other words, guys like Tommy. He had gone missing about a week after Larry, and he wasn't the only one. Tommy said that a few of them that wouldn't give up the bottle had also gone missing, just stopped showing up like Larry did, gone without a trace. Tommy and 3 of his close friends from the program were all a little scared now, not sure what was going on. They weren't sure what to do either, but it seemed that Tommy had come up with a plan. When I came home to find 2 new guys sitting in our apartment, I had some serious questions. "They're gonna stay with us for a little bit," Tommy said, "just till all this blows over." They introduced themselves as Chuck and Ferris, and they looked like the kind of guys that Tommy and I had hung out with on the street. They both had scraggly beards, faces just coming back from being wind-burnt, clothes that looked like they were from a rag bag, and shifty eyes that didn't quite trust what they saw. These guys were getting back on their feet, in other words, and I told them to stay as long as they needed to. That didn't stop me from moving everything I didn't want to disappear out of the living room to my room. Sometimes drunks take it in their heads to steal, and these three were no different. I noticed little things missing sometimes, but mostly it was just the food from the pantry. They had tremendous appetites, something I had failed to notice when it was just Tommy, and I found myself making frequent trips to the store. Besides eat, all they seemed to do was go to the program activities and sip from those endless bottles. It wasn't till they were all together that I started noticing how Tommy wasn't the palest of them either. They all looked ragged, all looked haggard, and all of them seemed utterly attached to those damn bottles. The weirdest part was how they drank from them. Each sip seemed to drag their lips into the neck, making their faces look long and stretched before they were released with a loud pop. The effect was a little sickening. After about a week of them coming to stay with us, Tommy handed me some flyers as I headed out to the corner store. "For Cecil, if he's still out there, we want people to know we're looking for him." I wanted to refuse him, but his face looked so nakedly hopeful that I just couldn't say no. The store owner wasn't excited about letting me hang the posters in the window, but he said to go ahead. I inevitably found myself stopping in the liquor aisle, my arms shaking a little as I buried the pissy little voice that told me to buy a bottle, to buy a case, put all this silly AA stuff behind me. I could be happy again, satisfied with the way I was, live happily ever after. I put my hand in my pocket and touched the AA chip that was there. I'd been doing it for a year now, and I'd noticed a real change in my life. That chip had become my bottle, I guess, and as I sat there and rubbed it, I felt a little better. Standing there getting right was probably why I noticed the weird can that was sitting at eye level beyond the glass door. I ain't proud of it, but I've gone through a lot of liquor in my time. I've drank most brands of gas station alcohol, and when I saw the gaudy silver can, it looked alien to me. It wasn't a brand I was familiar with, but the well-dressed man on the label was someone I had seen before. If I needed a reminder, all I had to do was walk outside and look at the front window. I had just hung his picture in that window, hadn't I? My hand shook as I reached for the can, and it took all my newfound control to take it back without stopping in a convenient alley and plunging into oblivion. It was from the brewery that ran the program that Tommy was in, and the beer was called Burbank's Best. I had intended to show it to Tommy, but it turned out that something had happened while I was away. I could hear a commotion from our apartment as I came up the stairs, and I arrived to find Tommy and one of his friends freaking out. They were standing around one of the big glass jugs they all had from the program and yelling about how Ferris was gone. When I asked where he had gone, they just kept pointing at the jug and saying he had gone in there. I got two of them calmed down a little, and Tommy was finally able to tell me the whole story. They had been drinking in the living room, taking pulls from their jugs, when Ferris had started coughing. They'd pounded him on the back, but Tommy said the third slap had sent a hand straight into his clothes. Before their very eyes, he had leaned over the jug, coughing into it harshly before simply sliding into the neck and sloshing into the container. When I asked him if that was even possible, They said his body had turned into liquid and he had simply fallen in. They'd set his jug on the coffee table in the living room, and I don't think any of us were capable of looking away from it. It was hard not to notice the set of nearly transparent eyes that floated inside like a mirage. The beer lay forgotten in the foyer. It may still be there to this day. We didn't leave the apartment for the next 5 days. Tommy and Chuck mostly just sat around, and I was afraid to leave them for more than quick bathroom trips. They snuck horrified glances at the jug on the coffee table, but seemed unable to stop themselves from sipping from their own. They'd witnessed something terrible, something none of them had expected, and now they were forced to come to terms with something unreal. I wasn't 100% sure that I believed them, but I couldn't deny the way they were acting. 2 days later, I wouldn't be able to live in ignorance any longer. 2 days later, and I would catch Chuck suffering the same fate. It was raining again as I cooked them breakfast, and I'd already decided to skip today's AA meeting like I had yesterday. My sponsor had come by the house to make sure that I hadn't relapsed, but one look at Tommy and Chuck had been enough to prove that I was helping a friend through troubled times. He said to maybe bring them to a meeting if they wanted to come, but they were both so shell-shocked that neither would do much besides eat and sleep. And drink, they still did plenty of that. Tommy had cut way back on his drinking, looking at the bottle with great distrust, but Chuck was really hooked through the bag. He would sob every time he took a drink, and every drink seemed to cost him more of the skin on his lips. His lips had looked chapped when I'd first met him, but now they looked like someone with fever blisters who keeps picking at them. I could see skin floating in the bottle sometimes, and the whole picture made me squeamy. I'd just plated some eggs and toast, the ladle for the grits in my hand, when I heard a loud thunk that was followed by Tommy's helpless wail. I turned towards the sound and saw the strangest thing I've ever witnessed. I'd seen atrocities before, seen women and children blown to pieces and men set on fire in the streets, but this was the closest my mind had ever come to simply packing its shit and stepping out. The bottle was on the floor, Chuck's hand tugging at the small handles on either side, but his head was stuck in the neck. He looked like a cartoon character, his suddenly malleable melon squeezed into the mouth of the jug. Through the glass, I could see his terrified face, his eyes roving around like a spooked horse, and the more he tugged, the more he seemed to fall inward. The jug had him, the bottle slowly consuming him, and after a particularly hard tug, he simply glooped into the jug, his body filling it to the breaking point. The sound of him pressing into the space was like a honey dipper truck pulling sewage from a porta potty. Tommy took up the bottle as I stood in the kitchen, the plate of eggs slipping out of my hand, and he stared into the glass with naked fear. Perhaps he thought he was looking into the future, but the look was inscrutable. "Chuck!" he yelled, and Chuck's pinched features stared out at him from inside the jug. Frozen as I was, I couldn't stop him as he reached for the bat we kept inside the door. I raised my voice to tell him not to, but as the metal slammed into the side of the bottle, I heard it shatter like a bell in the cold. Chuck may have been freed from his glass prison, but he was far from saved. His form was more liquid than solid now, his skin translucent as water. I could see his organs through his skin, his teeth through his mouth, and when he hit the floor amidst the glass, he began to slide through the carpet. The fabric drank him greedily, and when he tried to scream, His voice was like a burbling drain in a bathroom. He stared at us with naked fear as he sank, and whatever Chuck had become, he dribbled into the carpet and likely into the space between apartment floors. Tommy and I could do nothing but stand there and watch him go, the rain providing a backdrop for the tragedy before us. I'd like to tell you that Tommy smashed his own bottle and never picked it up again, but I can't lie to you any more than I can lie to myself. Tommy lasted another 2 days before the bottle took him. You might think it's odd, but we just sat there, not sure what to do. Who would believe us if we told them? No body was left behind, no evidence of a crime. What could the police do but laugh at a couple of drunks who had fallen off the wagon? I tried to call the Burbank program, but all I got was an automated system. The man from the city wasn't answering his phone either, and the longer it rang, the more I began to think that he had known this would happen. Was this their intention? Did they mean to erase an embarrassing element by means of the bottle? It might have been poetic, I guess, if I wasn't so close to the situation. As bad as I probably looked, Tommy was far worse. His own bottle sat in the corner where he had tossed it, but his bloodshot eyes kept tracking back to it. I tried to get him to eat or sleep or do anything but sit and stare, but Tommy seemed to have uncoupled from reality. If the TV was on, he would watch it. If it weren't, he would stare at the set blankly. Regardless, he seemed incapable or unwilling to move from the couch, and I worried that he would do something foolish. I was coming out of my room on the 4th day when I found him hunkered on the floor with the jug pressed against his lips. He looked ashamed to be caught doing so, but as I stared in disbelief, he only shook his head. I can't help it. The drink had me for as long as I can remember. It was only a matter of time before it took me completely, I guess. He laughed after he had freed his mouth from the opening, shaking his head at the absurdity of his statement. My mom used to say that about my dad. It's not his fault, Tom. The bottle took him. He's not himself when the bottle takes him, Tommy. I never understood that phrase until now, but I guess my dad and I aren't so different after all. The bottle took him, and now it's gonna get me too. He laughed, tipping it back as the liquid sloshed down the front of him, and I realized that I couldn't stay here and watch him kill himself with that damn glass monstrosity anymore. I went to my room and went back to bed, ignoring the strange watery sounds I heard from the living room. I came back later to find I was alone in the apartment, the jug sitting beside the couch, the only proof that Tommy had been there at all. As I stared at it, I wanted so many things at that moment. I wanted Tommy to come through the door and tell me that he'd just been out getting smokes. I wanted to call my sponsor and tell him I needed help. I wanted to slide into that same bottle and see what piece lay at the bottom. But above all else, I wanted a drink. Instead, I packed a bag and left. I knew that if I stayed there much longer, I would inevitably drink again. I hit the road, lived the life of a nomad for a while, and one day I found myself in Kashmir and saw a sign in the window of the hardware store looking for help. 8 years later, I'm the manager of that hardware store, but the bottle still threatens to take me. He leaned over the cup, and as the ball of sludge slid out of him, he made his own glooping noise. It fell into the tea like a chunk of ice, and as it splashed him, Winter was glad to see that the tea had cooled as he talked. She took the cup from him before he could come back around, and she had it secured in the cabinet with the others when he shook his head. It had been brown and smelled a little like hops. That was new. Did I pass out?" he asked, rising shakily to his feet. "A momentary fugue. I think we got to the root of the problem. You don't have to worry about it anymore." He nodded, smiling dopily as he tripped out of the room. She knew that he would feel a little hollow for the next few days, but he would ultimately forget that he'd been here at all. He would feel better then, but sometimes that hollow feeling would come back, and he wouldn't understand why. Dr. Winter wished she could take his desire to drink away so easily. But some things had claws that did more damage upon removal than when they were left well enough alone. Dr. Pamela Winters handed the fidgety little man a cup of tea as she sat across from him and committed his smallest details to memory. She'd met Tyler McDowell before, when he'd come to do a story on the clinic for the paper. He'd been a grinning little creature, his sarcastic tone letting her know how he felt about what she did here. He was skeptical, plain and simple, and when he made an appointment, an emergency appointment at that, Winter had been pleasantly surprised. Mr. McDowell was not the sort of man to suddenly believe in what they likely thought of as hokum. "So, Mr. McDowell, what brings you to my tacky den of charlatan ideas and pseudoscience?" she asked, smiling with deepest chagrin. "Oh, you read the article," he said nervously, blinking as the steam hit him in the face. "I've got it pinned up in my office somewhere. It was well written, despite its narrow opinion of me." He laughed, wincing as he took a sip and found the tea to be too hot. "So, what made you change your mind?" Tyler sat quietly, letting the steam waft up into his face as he collected his thoughts. Winter thought he looked like someone contemplating diving into that teacup and not coming up until the bubbles stopped. I saw something I need to forget. I thought it was something I needed to know, a mystery I needed to solve. But now I know that some secrets need to stay hidden." Winter smiled, taking a sip of her own tea as the winter cherry and ginseng wafted over her. "Tell me all about it, Mr. McDowell." Tyler had never been more terrified in his entire life. All he could think about was the man he'd been following for the past 3 weeks, and the repercussions of his little one-man spy operation. He knew it had been wrong, but he just couldn't help himself. Tyler had been curious since he was a kid. He collected insects in the area, geodes and fossils, read books about nature, and wanted to know so many things. His life's pursuit had been knowledge, but it appeared he had found something beyond even his curiosity. It had all started that morning in Ingalls. That was the first time that he'd seen the man. He'd been doing some grocery shopping, stocking up in case of a surprise snowstorm, the kind that sometimes blew in this time of year in North Georgia. Kashmir hadn't had a big dust-up like that in a few years, but the weather report said that it was supposed to be cold, and Tyler was taking no chances. Besides, he had some extra cash after the month the paper had been having. It wasn't every day that 6 kids went missing in Jeremiah, Georgia, and Tyler had been busy working on stories for the Kashmir Intrigue. It made him sound like a vulture, but the overtime he'd racked up in the service to the community was astonishing. He'd paid the next 6 months of his apartment on time, bought more games on the Steam winter sale than he'd ever play, and was now about to fill his pantry and enjoy a week's vacation from his supervisor. He swore under his breath as he dropped the cereal he'd been picking up, his gloves still slick from the rain, and as he bent to get it, someone else was already scooping it up and passing it to him. "Let me get that for you, buddy." Tyler had opened his mouth to thank the stranger, his crew cut looking straight enough to hold a level, but when he looked up, Tyler felt his stomach take a hard flip. The man was older, probably in his early 50s, and his crew cut was sprinkled with gray. He proved to be a head taller than Tyler, as he stood to his full height, and his chest looked broader than the little reporter's whole body. He was dressed normally enough, and would have looked fairly normal if it hadn't been for his perfect onyx eyes. He didn't mean that the man's irises were dark. He didn't mean his eyes possessed a dark color. Tyler meant the man's eyes were nothing but perfect black orbs, both of which were staring at him with confusion. Tyler shook it off, taking the cereal with a shaky hand and muttering "thank you" as he scuttled back to his cart and tried not to look back, lest he start to stare. When he peeked behind him, the man had left, but he still felt like he could see those eyes looking at him. Tyler checked around the corner and kept his head on a constant swivel as he tried to avoid seeing the dark-haired man again. But he couldn't seem to get him out of his head. Everywhere he looked, he could see those pitch-black eyes, somehow expressive despite their depth. Tyler got his groceries quickly, thankfully not running into the stranger again, until he got ready to leave. As he left the supermarket, he suddenly felt a crawling feeling on the back of his neck. He turned and saw the man looking at him from the end of an aisle, his beetle-black eyes focused on him intently. Tyler left the man behind, but he never quite let him lie. After that, he became aware of the man any time he saw him around town. He didn't believe he had ever seen him before, but now his eyes seemed to focus on him any time he found him. In the bank, at the post office, sipping coffee at the cafe on the corner. Tyler saw him everywhere he went. The man's black eyes also seemed to notice him, and Tyler often thought that he looked at him with interest when their paths crossed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the man was an outsider. Kashmir wasn't a big place. The whole town was home to maybe 5,000 people, the most anyone knew anyway. A man with black eyes would stand out, especially in a place like Kashmir. But Tyler had never seen him before. He started asking around to see if anyone knew him, but no one seemed to know what he was talking about. "If there's a guy in town with black eyes, I think I'd have noticed," his editor said when he called him. "You sure you're feeling all right, Ty? Not working too hard, are you?" It wasn't that he was the only one who could see him. He wasn't crazy. People had seen the older fellow with the crew cut, but they all agreed that his eyes had been a perfectly normal icy blue. "Maybe a little intense," Dale, the cashier at Ingalls, said, "but certainly not midnight black." Asking around, Tyler learned that the man's name was Gary Lodge. He was a retired military man, though no one seemed to know which war he had fought in. Old Ralph said he'd claimed to be from Vietnam, but Mark Kittrell had argued that it was the Gulf War. Randy Markey told them that they were both full of crap, and the man had said that he was a sergeant in the Iraq War. Tyler had had to get their attention before they could start yelling at each other. They'd been sitting on the porch of Pap's, a gas station that had been sitting on the edge of Kashmir since the end of the Great Depression. The three old gaffers looked as if they may have been sitting there 5 years before that, just waiting for the station to spring up around them. "Did he say what branch he belonged to?" Tyler asked, already guessing the answer. "Army," Ralph said confidently. "Navy, of course," Mark said simultaneously. "Marines, hoorah!" exclaimed Randy in chorus. They all took a second to look at each other before beginning their argument again. Tyler left before it became too heated. This was how it all began, his obsession with the man named Gary Lodge. It started out with questions. He asked people what they knew about the man, what he'd told them, what he had done before this, and reports varied wildly. Some said he had been a trucker before retiring to the mountains. Some said he was an ex-cop from Atlanta who wanted something a little quieter. Others said that he was ex-military and he was seeking solitude. He lived in the mountains near town, though no one seemed to know which one. All agreed that he drove an old green Jeep with a canvas covering the roof, and Tyler had seen it parked outside various establishments in town. Tyler spent the better part of 5 days asking people around him, but the more he discovered, the less he actually knew. A background check netted him nothing but a trip after his tail. He couldn't find a Gary Lodge that owned anything in the area. His Jeep was unregistered in the county, and no one named Gary Lodge had so much as a bank account, credit card, or a library card that tied him to Kashmir. He got nothing back when he tried to search for his service record. No work history, rental history, or credit history either. Either he was using an alias, or he was a ghost. And Tyler didn't believe in ghosts. These should have been red flags, signs to let it alone. But Tyler couldn't. You see, even when he slept, it seemed he couldn't escape Gary Lodge. Every night since that first meeting, Tyler had been plagued by the same dream. He was running through the woods, seeing the same pines and oaks that he'd climbed and sat beneath as a child, his eyes darting as something hunted him. He would catch a glimpse of those black eyes as he ran, his body twisting as it slid through the gaps in the trees like a shadow. He was hunting him, stalking him through the familiar woodlands, and no matter how far he ran, he was unable to escape the phantom who pursued him. It only got worse after he saw him in the alley 2 weeks after the first meeting. Tyler had been leaving the office, waving at Gerald the janitor as he made his way to his car. "Knocking off early, Mr. Duncan?" Tyler nodded. "Can't seem to focus today. I guess I'm just not in the mood to burn the midnight oil." Gerald laughed, but Tyler knew it was more than simple focus. He was feeling close to burnout, the dreams beginning to take a toll on him. When he woke up from the dreams, he felt exhausted, his mind having spun itself out. He wasn't sure how much longer he could do this and stay sane. He walked to his car, intending to climb in and try to get some undaunted sleep. But he changed his mind as the key slid into the door lock. At that moment, a soft electric sound could be heard from the nearby bar on the square. Tyler decided that instead of going home, he would go have a few drinks and maybe fall asleep to some dream that didn't involve the black-eyed man. He left his car in the parking lot, figuring he could get an Uber home and then another to work the next day. He had gone about 1.5 blocks up when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. He had passed an alley between a pharmacy and a convenience store and heard a scuffle from farther back. Tyler paused in the mouth of the alleyway and thought about pressing on. It was probably just a couple of drunks arguing, maybe a few homeless people squabbling over choice sleeping spots. And it had nothing to do with him. He could have just headed to the bar, got his beer, and headed home a little bit sloshed later that night. But his curious nature, something that had taken him far in his career of choice, drove him to go investigate. With every step he took into the dirty alley, he felt more and more sure that this was not something he wanted to investigate. It sounded less like a fight and more like something a little more intimate. He wanted to turn around, but if something less than consensual was going on, he felt it was his duty to inform the authorities about it. What he found was indeed less than consensual. In the small alley behind the convenience store, 2 people were scuffling as one of them tied the other one up. Tyler peeked around the edge, not entirely sure what he was looking at. It appeared to be 2 men, one of them vigorously declining being tied up, while the other one paid him no attention. It was hard to tell from the single light on the pole behind the convenience store, but something appeared to be wrong with the man who was being bound. It almost looked like his skin was bubbling, and part of him seemed to be lengthening and shortening at will. He was still wildly insisting that the man had the wrong guy. The fella needed to just let him go, but his captor paid him no attention. He was a beefy guy, wearing old camouflage pants and a gray jacket that looked ready for the rag bag. As he finished restraining him, he pushed him into a corner. The man wept as the other pulled out a large handgun and pointed it at him. That was when Tyler realized that this was more than just a little foreplay. The man told the weeper to shut up as he held the gun on him, and Tyler watched him cock his head as if he were listening for something. When he turned his head, the light hit him just right, and Tyler saw the neat crew cut and solid black eyes of the man who had haunted his dreams. The restrained man looked up at him, spitting blood from his lip as Gary Lodge seemed to wait for just the right moment to end him. All at once, though, the man began to shift, and his body began to grow. His head took on a distinctly dog-like cast, and his body elongated. The man with the crew cut seemed torn about whether or not to just go ahead and shoot him, or wait for whatever signal he was waiting for. Tyler could see the wolf man beginning to flex at his bonds, the ropes groaning angrily, and thought Gary's time might be about up. That was when the band, who had been preparing to start at the bar that Tyler should have been drinking at, struck up their first song, a loud honky-tonk number that would have probably covered the rapture. The man with the crew cut shot the other right between the eyes. The half-man died mid-transformation, his body stuck somewhere between as he bled onto the concrete. Gary looked around, his ears raised as he listened for alarms being sounded, as he slid the gun away. Tyler stood transfixed for a moment, trying to make sense of all of it. He had just watched the black-eyed man murder somebody. More than that, he had watched him murder someone who was not entirely human. As the man with the crew cut bent down to pick up his victim, Tyler realized that this would be his chance to run. As the band and the bar hit the high point of a boozy little number, he lit out towards the newspaper parking lot. His plan to get a little tipsy completely evaporated as he ran, nearly bumping into the old green Jeep that was parked beside the alley. He didn't stop running until he got to his car and sped out of the parking lot. The next time he saw Gary Lodge, he was reminded of that incident in the alleyway. The next time he saw the black-eyed man, he thought he was about to be on the receiving end of that single gunshot. It happened about 2 days after the incident in the alley. Tyler had been living those days in a constant state of fear. He'd been calling out of work and only leaving his apartment if it was absolutely necessary. On the second day, something absolutely necessary came up. His editor had needed him to come in and sign something that just couldn't wait. Tyler had tried to wiggle out from under it, but the man was insistent that it needed to go to payroll by Friday, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It turned out to be his expense report from the story he had done in Jeremiah. Tyler had signed them, insisting that he had to go after he was done, and went quickly to his vehicle. He'd been digging his keys out of his pocket, looking around fitfully, when the man with the crew cut came quickly from around the back of Tyler's car. Tyler felt his breath catch in his throat, certain he was about to be a squib in one of the town's newspapers. Beloved writer killed in senseless daylight shooting. Unlikely to be the headline, but one could hope. "Heard you been asking a lot of questions about me," the man said, and his voice was nowhere near as friendly as it had been the first time. He stood leaning against Tyler's SUV with all the cool carelessness of a hunting cat. "Asking questions is kind of my job," Tyler answered, stuttering over most of his words and sounding much less assured of himself than he had hoped. "I don't like it," said the man with the black eyes. "I don't like people asking questions about me. I hear any more people say you've been asking questions, or I get another ping that you've been looking for me online, and I'll come visit you again. Rest assured, that's one visit you don't want, little man." He didn't wait for Tyler to say anything. He just walked away, heading back up the street in the direction Tyler assumed he had come from. Tyler watched him go, still shaken by his words. He hadn't felt quite that scared since the football players had roughed him up in high school, and the feeling kindled something else in him. This guy was no different from those meatheads on the football team, the ones who had thrown his books on the floor and pushed him into lockers. He was a bully, and Tyler didn't have to put up with bullies anymore. He was an adult, and he could do something about the bullies now. He wanted to find out more, wanted to know everything. So, when he'd seen the green Jeep in traffic a few days later, he pulled in behind him without thinking about it. His guts were a mess of snakes, anxiously writhing over each other as he followed him out of Kashmir. He had no proof that he was going to his house. No one even knew where he lived. But as Tyler followed him, his gut told him the old Jeep was heading home. Guy must have seen him, had to have recognized him, but Tyler didn't care. Plus, if he asked, he could always tell him that he had business in this direction. This was the road that led to the interstate, after all, and the interstate was pretty much the only way to go in Georgia. He had followed him for about 20 minutes, sure he was going to discover nothing but an on-ramp, when Guy put his blinker on and turned down an access road that was all but invisible. Tyler watched him turn, rebelling against every instinct he had to turn in behind him, and proceeded instead towards the interstate. Once he was sure the Jeep was out of sight, he turned into a driveway at the edge of the interstate and wheeled back around. The couple on the porch lifted their hands to him, and Tyler lifted his in return. They were clearly used to being the city's turnabout, and as he left, he wondered if they would tell anyone they'd seen him. Once he considered that they might have no idea who he was, this thought made him feel nothing but like a paranoid mess, and he went back to the access road he'd seen the Jeep go down. He wanted to drive down the road, but Tyler knew that would be a bad idea. Instead, he pulled off to the side, driving his car between the trees so it wouldn't be readily seen. He popped the trunk and took out a knapsack. Tyler had carried a bug-out bag for years. A lot of people did, and it had everything he might need to live in the woods for a few days. It was too much for what he had in mind, but it did have a few things he wanted. Binoculars, a flashlight, a hunting knife, some food in case he got lost. He slung it on before he could think too much about the plan and set off into the woods. He used the road as a guide, making his way through the woods as he kept the concrete serpent always on his right. He expected to see other roads, perhaps some other houses, but all that was here was more road. As he went, Tyler started to feel a sense of déjà vu. He had never been to these woods before, but the farther in he went, the more it began to feel like a waking dream. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the form of his stalker as he kept a close eye on him. It was like a dream all over again, and it sent a chill up his spine as he expected to run into his monster with every step. He'd been walking for about 45 minutes when he found the last thing he expected. He found a fence surrounding a collection of little buildings and a sign declaring this to be Site 9. One of the buildings was clearly a warehouse, long and tall with a slight mechanical hum coming from it. The other two were squat concrete boxes that looked like they might have been living quarters, and the Jeep was pulled up outside of one of these. Tyler dug his binoculars out and swept the grounds, looking for any sign of Guy, but he didn't have far to look. The closest concrete box was no more than 20 feet from the fence, and when Guy's voice preceded him by only a few seconds, Tyler nearly dropped the binoculars. "I think the townies are on to me," he said, and Tyler got as low as he could without making any noise. "There's a reporter sniffing around. I think he's marked me." He put his back to the concrete box and listened to whoever was talking on the phone. "I wouldn't be so worried, TJ, if it wasn't a damn reporter. Yeah, I know, my back trail's covered up, but it's still a little spooky. He asks a lot of questions, and I don't want him guessing anything about the black sites." He listened, nodding along, and Tyler realized he was talking about him. How angry would he be if he realized the subject of his worries was less than 30 feet away, listening to his conversation? He laughed suddenly, and Tyler tensed up to stop from jumping. "Loyalty? TJ, I could give a rat's ass if all these freak shows burn to the ground. If this guy finds out about the sites, there are 2 bullets that are going to fire, and only one of them is for him. I'm grateful you guys are helping me with my psychosis from the war, but I'm not about to find myself at Site 7 so I can eat a bullet for that." Tyler had started trying to walk backwards on his fingertips, slowly making his way away from the fence. He had learned all he needed to, all he thought he needed to at least, and now he simply wanted to disappear before Mr. McGregor happened to notice there was a rabbit in his garden. He came up short, however, when he realized he was caught on a branch. "Yeah, I'm still tracking the crypt. No, not a sniff in the last 2 weeks. She's old and wily, but I'll get her. This place is like a safari anyway. I don't know what it is about this state, but there's critters everywhere. Just last week I found an honest-to-God lycanthrope. I haven't seen one of those since Wales. I didn't even know there were real ones in America. Yeah, but they don't count. Those are mutts. This one was a pedigree werewolf. But he stopped and looked to the fence line. Tyler winced. He'd heard the snap too, as he tried to get his pack free. It had been loud enough to hear back at his car, he'd warrant. As Guy stared in his direction, he stayed absolutely still, those black eyes boring into the trees as he hunkered. Tyler wasn't religious. He'd been agnostic since he was 15, but he prayed now that this black-eyed devil would overlook him so he could get away. "I'll call you back, TJ." "Nah, not for long." He hung up the phone and disappeared into the concrete box, Tyler taking the opportunity to shimmy back as he unstuck and let out. He ran away from the fence, never looking back as he tried his best to get away from the monster he had startled. It was like his dream all over again, and Tyler expected to turn his head and see those black eyes tracking him. He thought he heard someone trailing him, dogging his heels, but when he made it back to the main road, he threw his backpack into the car and hopped behind the wheel. As he cranked the engine, he looked out to see Guy stalking the woods, a long rifle in hand. Tyler cranked the engine, watching Guy glance at the car, and threw it in reverse as he fled down the road. No hail of bullets followed him, no eruption of glass as his back window exploded. Just Guy, as he stood in the road watching him go, a knowing smile stretching over his face. "What did you do then?" Winter asked, taking a sip of tea. His cup was nearly empty, and she could see his chest hitching a little, as if he had a throat full of phlegm. "I went home and prayed that he hadn't had time to read my license plate. It was a work car, thankfully, but I've been getting calls from them the past 3 days, letting me know he keeps showing up to ask questions about me. He found the car in the parking lot, and someone told him I was driving it. I think he knows that if I go missing, they'll connect him to the incident, but I don't know how much longer that's going to stop him. But how will you know to avoid him if you forget him?" "I don't know," Tyler said, his face resolved as he looked down at his tea, "but I can't live like this. I'm a coward, Miss Winter, but if I don't know I'm supposed to be afraid, maybe I can die with some dignity. For once in my life, I'd rather not face adversity with fear in my belly. Whether he kills me in my sleep or kills me on the street, I'd rather go out blissfully unaware. And who knows, maybe when he sees that I have no idea who he is or what he's doing, he'll leave me alone. It's worth a shot, right?" He gagged suddenly, and Winter watched as a thick round something fell wetly into his cup. He set it down, looking around in confusion, before locking eyes with Winter from across the table. "Dr. Winter?" he said, his smile seemingly embarrassed. What am I doing here?" Winter exhaled, setting her own cup down. "You came for a follow-up interview, something your editor wanted. I told you no, however, and when you got up to leave, you got lightheaded and sat down for a bit." "I did?" Tyler asked, looking sheepish as he rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a first for me. Oh, well, I must get back to the office now. Good luck in your—" He didn't seem to be able to come up with a word, so he just spun his hands at her office and left. Winter took his cup and put it in the cabinet. They were such odd creatures, these humans. They were capable of great bravery, though they often had to be tricked into it. Amidst his terror, Tyler Deborah had found a splinter of courage. Winter hoped it would be enough to get him through what was likely to come next. She dumped the lumpy thing he had coughed up in a mason jar, where it bobbed and glowed slightly as she screwed the lid back on. It was a perfect sky blue when it pulsed, and that made Winter smile. She liked the blue ones. They were her favorite. A shot rang out from the sidewalk in front of her office, and she heard people cry out as they called for the police. "Someone come quick!" Winter heard a particularly shrill oldster yell. "This young man's been shot!" Winter sighed, possessed of great bravery and great stupidity. "Mr. Pate, how are you today?" The man sitting across from her looked like he was doing quite poorly. Calling him a man might have been generous, Dr. Winter saw. He was a large teen, probably still in high school, but his face bore the same look usually reserved for death row inmates. Though filled with melancholy, he had none of the trappings that usually accompanied children in their late teens. His arms bore none of the self-harm scars Winter usually found. He wasn't festooned in dark colors or piercings, and even his hair was unassuming. Still, something seemed to hang around him like a smog cloud, and Winter was curious to find out what it was. "I've had a pretty unique childhood, and there are some things I'd like to get rid of. I've talked to people who say you're legit. I'm hoping you can help me." Winter nodded, rising as she made him a cup of tea. Winter cherry, ginseng, and something known only to her created a heady brew in her nose as she filled the cup. When she handed it to him, some of his despair melted away. He took a careful sip, wincing as he burned himself a little, but smacking his lips appreciatively. You'll have to tell me where you get this when I'm done. I think this is the best tea I've ever had." "It's a special blend," she said, picking up her notebook as she took up her own cup and had a sip. "Now, why don't you start with what you'd like to forget?" "I guess it all started about 7 years ago, when I lived with my uncle on his estates. My uncle was kind of a weird guy. I lived with him for 2 years after CPS took me away from my parents. My parents were not what you would call reliable caregivers. They were more interested in pushing dope into their veins than caring for a child, so I was bounced around between family members after the state finally took action. Thankfully, I've got a pretty big family, and most of them are pretty reliable. My aunt is a photographer for a magazine, and took me for 2 years. I was 4 and still young enough to accompany her when she left town for business, but she feared that I wouldn't get a consistent education living with her. So, I went to stay with my grandparents for a while. My grandma was a loving woman with plenty of time for a growing boy and a curious child. My grandfather, however, was a grouchy old man who didn't want some young kid running around and making a lot of noise. I stayed with them for a few years until Gramps had enough of it one day and asked my uncle if he would take me. He agreed, so I packed my things and went to stay with Uncle Mark. One thing you should know about my uncle is that he's loaded. I don't know exactly how much he's worth, but he had purchased a small estate outside our hometown with 10 acres and a manor home. I have no idea how he made his money, but that leads right into the second important thing about Uncle Mark. He's nuts. Everyone knew it. Everyone accepted it. He wasn't nuts in the traditional way, the kind that will get you put away forever. Uncle Mark just believed in some rather outlandish things. He believed heavily in the occult, especially their connection to important figures in the government. He'd talk for hours about the Illuminati or the Skull and Bones controversy, and he'd tell anyone who would listen about how demons and hell are as real as you and I. So, when a big black sedan pulled up to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and a guy with greasy dark hair and a neat suit stepped out to get my door, I assumed he was just a fancy cab driver. The man identified himself as Cassius, and it turned out that he was Uncle Mark's right-hand man. The drive wasn't long, but it seemed to last longer since Cassius said nothing. We turned off the road, and I could see Uncle Mark's mansion as it rose above the trees. It had once belonged to a general in the Civil War, my uncle told me multiple times, and he had spent a fortune restoring it to its glory days. People were milling about when we pulled up, and I pressed my nose against the glass as I counted about 10 men and women in sand-colored robes going about their tasks. "Who are they?" I asked, nose still pressed against the glass. "They are your uncle's disciples. He's gotten quite a following in our community, and some people like to live close so they can receive his wisdom." I had about 1,000 questions, but Cassius was around the car and opening my door before I noticed he'd stopped it. He showed me inside, and the house looked more like a museum than a home. The more I saw, the more excited I became. It looked like a house from an old movie, everything being lacquered wood and old soft furniture. A fire was burning in the grate, and I could see more of the robed people as they cleaned. I'd thought maybe there were a few families here, 5 or 10 people at the most, but the more I saw, the more I realized that there were more people here than I'd imagined. We went upstairs, Uncle Mark wanting to have a look at me, and when Cassius pushed open the door to my uncle's library, I got my first look at Uncle Mark as he sat in his element. He smiled and welcomed me warmly to my new home. "It's good to see you, my boy. I'm glad we can finally speak candidly." I'd only met my Uncle Mark a handful of times, but I knew my dad was a little bit scared of him. He said Uncle Mark was always into weird stuff when they were growing up, and if a smack addict is afraid of you, there's gotta be a pretty good reason. The few times I'd met him, he seemed like a nice enough guy. Uncle Mark always asked weird questions, like if I could read or if I could see strange things, but I always figured he was just having the same problems my parents were. Dad said all kinds of weird stuff when he was high, so I assumed these interactions were normal. Living with Uncle Mark showed me that these things were only normal for Uncle Mark. I tried to pay attention as my uncle told me about his home, but I couldn't stop looking around at the mountain of books that surrounded me. I'd taught myself to read, though my mom had helped a little. It gave me something to do while my parents lived in a warm haze. I loved books, and I was a voracious reader. I wanted to explore this place filled with so many new experiences, but I'd begun to notice that many of them looked strange. Quite a few were written in languages I couldn't read, but that made me want to learn all the more. "You like books, do you?" he said, and his laugh was rich and genuine. "Seems you and I share a similar desire for knowledge." I turned back to him, afraid of the coming slap or the yell that would ring through my head, but he just smiled at me, no clouds darkening his mood. I think I truly saw him for the first time then. He was dressed like a sultan, his white robes covered in strange symbols, and his pointy shoes were up on the ottoman. He was drinking something from a real glass and being attended to by people who wore the same brown robes the others did. He told me that he'd been looking forward to meeting me for years, and it was the first time I think someone other than my aunt or maybe my grandma had been genuinely happy to have me around. I told him we had met a few times before, but Uncle Mark said he'd been waiting to meet me properly. "Your father and I never really got along, but I could tell that you were a little brighter than your parents. They kept you from me because they were afraid I'd tell you the truth. I'm glad that you finally found your way to listen." That was the start of my education. Uncle Mark and I talked a lot that day, and he explained what he wanted for me. Uncle Mark had created a paradise for himself here, but it had come at a price. He could not have children, and would have no one to carry on his legacy when he was gone. He wanted to teach me his ways, teach me the things that had brought him success, and in exchange, I would inherit his legacy when he passed on. But only if you learn the things I have to teach. I can make you better than you were, better than where you've come from, but you must be willing to learn. I told him I wanted to learn, not knowing what that terrible knowledge would be. I would learn in time. Uncle Mark took me out of school, deciding to homeschool me instead. I'd been a good student. I'd mostly received A's and B's, but Uncle Mark's lessons were a little different. He still taught me math and English, but the history lessons were more of an arcane variety. He taught me about witch trials, the beginnings of secret societies, practitioners of actual magic, as he called them, and many other things I'd never heard of. He taught me to read the books he kept in the library, too, and seemed happy when I took to languages like a sponge. They say kids will do that, but I look back now and see that some of the languages were so archaic that it should be impossible for anyone to read them. I never had to take any of the tests that I had to take back in school, and I think now that Uncle Mark must have been bribing someone to keep them from having a closer look at his curriculum. It wasn't like going to Hogwarts or anything. Uncle Mark told me that real capital M magic takes years to cultivate, and I needed to build a foundation before I was ready to do spell work. He believed I'd be ready in a few years, and my days were spent poring over old books and learning runes and sigils in languages I came to be very familiar with. This went on for years, and culminated one night when he called me to the basement. I came down at moonrise, not an uncommon time for Uncle Mark to teach me lessons. I found a bunch of his disciples making symbols on the ground with chalk, as others used crowbars to chisel open canals in the stone. Some of them I understood, but many were things I had never seen before. Uncle Mark held court over all, nodding here and telling them to fix little things there. When he saw me, he put a hand on my shoulder and cast his other hand out like a game show host showing off prizes. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something, but I wasn't sure what he wanted. I was 12 after all, and all this was a little new to me. "Well," he finally said, looking a little perturbed. "It's, pretty cool, Uncle Mark." "Pretty cool?" he asked skeptically. "It's a little more than pretty cool, my boy. As my apprentice, I would expect you to recognize a greater circle of binding." That got my attention. Uncle Mark had taught me about circles. Some of them were used for protection, some of them were used to channel things, and some of them were used to hold things, if you could get them inside. This one, it appeared, was one of the latter variety. I didn't know what Uncle Mark was trying to catch in his circle, but everything I had read made me think it might be a bad idea. "What are you gonna try to catch?" I asked, unable to help myself. "A demon," he said almost casually. He must have heard me suck in breath, because I pretended to cough when I felt him look at me. I'd been learning about all these things, but I wasn't really sure I believed any of them. I'd watched my uncle do some pretty cool tricks, but I'd never actually seen him do magic. Parlor tricks, things you could see on any Las Vegas show stage, sure, but nothing like Lord of the Rings or anything. He was a good enough manipulator to convince people he could do magic, but I always figured that was about as far as it went. Is it safe?" I asked, and for good reason. All the books Uncle Mark had in his library about demons made them sound dangerous and temperamental. Priests would sometimes banish demons back to their plane of existence, and warlocks sometimes pressed them into service, but demons were strong and usually best left alone. The idea that my uncle wanted to trap one made me very uneasy. "You're with me, boy. There's nowhere that could be safer." But when he said it, his hand tightened a little on my shoulder, almost painfully. Uncle Mark had never been cruel to me, but I knew he could turn mean if the mood took him. I'd seen him yell at some of his followers, even seen him hit a few of them, and I knew enough to know that I didn't want that anger turned on me. I shut my mouth, nodding along as I agreed with him. Uncle Mark had always been careful up to this point, but his sudden desire to show his power in some grand gesture was not what I was used to. Most of this probably had to do with Samuel. Samuel had been one of Uncle Mark's oldest followers, besides Cassius. He acted as the representative between my uncle and his followers, but lately, something had changed. He'd begun to tell people that Uncle Mark was a charlatan, and they should follow him instead, since he had the real magic. Uncle Mark could have just thrown him out, but that might lend some credence to Samuel's lies. My uncle lived comfortably here with his servants, and losing them might cut into some of that comfort. Thus, Uncle Mark would have to prove his powers. I watched as his disciples worked, observing in silence as Uncle Mark corrected their labors. The circle was made of different items, each ring a collection of something unique. The inside ring was silver, his followers heating the metal as they set it into the floor. The middle layer was gold, and they poured the molten liquid right into the stone ring. It was crisscrossed with veins of silver once it cooled, and gems were set into the hardening ooze at key points. The outer ring was the oddest of all, a circle of frozen water that seemed ever on the verge of sweating back into a liquid state. The combination of elements was impressive, but I couldn't begin to understand how they all came together. "When do you think you'll trap it?" I asked, watching the rings come together. "Tonight, I should think," he said, smirking at me like he'd just told the most outrageous joke. So soon?" I asked, hoping I had misheard. Uncle Mark's face grew stern as he watched them at their work. "It's time to put Samuel in his place." As the hours ticked closer to midnight, Uncle Mark assembled his disciples. Samuel was amongst them, looking smug as he watched my uncle open his battered old grimoire and begin chanting. Uncle Mark never said where he found that old book, but I'd seen it many times. As he spoke, the rings began to hum, and the stones in them seemed to twinkle with eldritch light. He turned to look at his followers, seeing the circle flare to life, and his smile was confident as his eyes fell on Samuel. "My students, I'd like to thank you for joining me tonight. I know there have been some amongst you who recently have come to doubt my power, but doubt no longer. Tonight I will demonstrate my ability for you by catching and caging one of the strongest entities of the 9 hells, a demon." A thrum came through the crowd, but Samuel pretended to yawn as he grinned at my uncle. Samuel clearly thought Uncle Mark would do no more than put on a light show for us. But he was wrong. Uncle Mark had clearly brought his A-game and meant to show us all who the real wizard was that night. He drew 5 others to the points of the star, Cassius opposite him in the order, and they began to chant and call out to something whose name could not be known to mortals. Demon names are strange. They sound furry on the tongue. They have too many consonants. Their vowels are not in ordinary places. The members of the circle began to chant the name, and the circle danced with fairy fire. As they chanted, the inside began to pulsate with strange light. I trusted my uncle, even revered him, but I secretly agreed with Samuel. My uncle was a man of means, and clearly this was some show meant to cow the spectators. He would call something from a secret compartment in the floor, I had no doubt, but I doubted it would be some demon from the pits. Most likely it would be someone in a costume, some convincing bit of prosthesis that, in the dancing firelight and the moody shadows of the basement, would seem very real and very devilish. The chanting and light show went on for the better part of half an hour, and many of his disciples had begun to fidget nervously. They had become slightly bored by it, and some of them might have even begun to think that Samuel was right. My uncle had meant for this to prove his power, but all it was doing was cementing in their minds that he was a fake. Samuel seemed unbothered by any of this. He stood with his arms crossed across his chest, smirking at my uncle as he dared him to do something besides stand there and embarrass himself. That was when Uncle Mark obliged him. The chanting stopped suddenly, and my uncle raised his head and uttered a single guttural word that the rest had been chanting constantly. It fell confidently from his mouth, and there was no slur or hiccup in his pronunciation. He spoke it with a practiced tongue, and it seemed to vibrate the room as he uttered it. Melisfrul Rhine. Suddenly, and without warning, an unearthly scream echoed across the chamber. In the center of the circle, a creature that defied logic had appeared. It was man-shaped, but bestial formed. Its head appeared to be that of a bulldog, but there was no happy lapping face on this one. Its body was something like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, set onto the torso of a silverback gorilla. It had 4 massive arms, 3 huge legs, and a set of wings that seemed to crackle against the invisible dome as they attempted to unfurl. It was the color of molten cheese baked into a cheap pan, and its skin seemed to undulate like a living sore. That's the closest I can come to describing it. Its dimensions and form were not of this world, and to try would be to do it a disservice. As the creature loosed another of those unearthly screams, the disciples fell to their knees and began to pray to my uncle to save them from this abomination. "Worry not," he said smugly. "He cannot hurt you. I have trapped him inside a greater circle, and he is mine to command." The demon flexed his arms, ready to test this, but as I watched, its eyes seemed to dart around the room as if it were counting. The demon relaxed when it saw how many were assembled, glaring at my uncle as if he were the most audacious thing he had ever seen. I didn't trust its sudden helplessness, and wanted nothing so much as to tell my uncle to release it before something terrible happened. I wish now that I had, despite the beating it would have likely earned me. "Are ye he who is known as Marcus Pate?" The demon's voice was deep and dark, and my uncle had to steel himself to avoid the shudder that tried to ripple up him. "Do you see? Even the demons of hell know of me." Whether the creature agreed with this statement or not, it remained quiet. It sat in the circle, folding its legs as it hungered in the circle's confines, glowering at my uncle. Its dog face was filled with rage, and I sensed a quiet patience in it. The demon was a being of the burning hells, an immortal creature of another plane. It could wait for my uncle to die if it needed to, and I think it knew that. As I turned to ask my uncle something, I was suddenly aware that a small throng of disciples were around him. Samuel was amongst them, confessing his sins to Uncle Mark and telling him how sorry he was to have doubted him. My uncle played the magnanimous guru, but I could tell how much he ate this up. Uncle Mark was wise, but also had a deep reservoir of ego that enjoyed being placated. He generously forgave them, telling them how they knew better now, and sent them off to their assigned tasks. "Cassius, you may take the next watch of this one," he said, indicating the demon. "My young ward and I will take the first. Come by sunrise and bring your wits. He may try to trick you and gain his freedom." Cassius said he would be there at dawn, and they left, my uncle and I finding ourselves alone with this creature. Uncle Mark said nothing the whole night. He walked around the circle, observing the demon from every angle. He seemed in awe of his own daring, not quite believing it had worked. The demon studied him as well, its piggy eyes glaring at him with hatred. The creature's intentions were clear, and I feared what it would do to Uncle Mark if it ever got loose. I was still young enough that the thought of my own death was laughable, but Uncle Mark had been so kind to me and given me so much that the thought of something happening to him was truly upsetting. As the three of us kept our vigils, the creature turned his attention from my uncle to me. I was watching the demon as it followed Uncle Mark, when its head suddenly shifted on its thick neck to regard me. Its eyes bore into me, the doggish face holding a pair of suddenly captivating orbs. Those eyes seemed to promise me things. They told me of great prizes that could be mine, and when my uncle stepped in front of me, I glowered and tried to lunge around him. When he slapped me across the face, I shook myself, unsure of what had happened. "Don't let him hook you, son. He's a terrible beast, and lies are like manna to him." "I wish you'd turn him loose," I whispered, unable to stop myself from peeking under his arm at it. I don't think I'll sleep a wink as long as it's in the house." "Don't be foolish," he spat, suddenly angry. "This creature is my legacy, and I'll let all the naysayers and doubters have a look." The idea of letting people down here to see it filled me with a sort of dread. I didn't know what my uncle was planning, but I suddenly felt sure that it would go poorly. Uncle Mark began sending out invitations. Not emails, not phone calls, but actual invitations. They were these strange little cream-colored things with black traces on the edges, proclaiming that the holder was invited to a miraculous evening. It honestly made him sound more like a Vegas showman than a master of the universe, but he assured me that it was how things were done in his circles. "They will expect a little showmanship for what I have in store for them." He sent them to everyone, it seems, rivals and friends alike, especially to those who had doubted him. Uncle Mark had been running in the circles since his late teens, and seemed to have accumulated more doubters and rivals than actual friends. Like Samuel, many looked at him as a charlatan, but he assured me that he would end all that a week from now. "When they see what I have in store, no one will doubt my power again." His disciples set about making the house ready for guests. Rooms were cleaned, new furniture was brought in, and many little display cases were set up around the house so Uncle Mark could show off his collection. There were wands, daggers, books, even items my uncle claimed were enchanted. These were all things he had found on his journeys, and he hoped they would lend credence to his claims. The demon stayed inside the circle, but I'd come to mistrust that placid beast whenever I had reason to be in the cellar. He never moved, never ate, never drank, and seemed only to watch those who were with him. That wasn't to say that he wasn't busy as well. In that week, 3 of my uncle's disciples killed themselves while on watch, one of them tearing out his own eyes and tongue. By Wednesday, Uncle Mark had taken to guarding him himself. The 2 of us sat down there for hours with the creature, and if Uncle Mark wasn't guarding him, then Cassius and Samuel had the task. Samuel was like a changed man after witnessing Uncle Mark's summoning. He apologized daily for doubting him, and there was no more talk of leaving amongst the disciples. He and Cassius seemed to be the only 2 Uncle Mark felt could be trusted to watch the creature, other than himself and I, of course. That's how I came to be in the cellar with him that night, before the gathering, and had a moment to speak with the demon. Uncle Mark had been awake for 2 days, and I was unsurprised to find him sleeping in his chair around 2 in the morning. The demon had noticed him too, and our gazes found each other yet again. I approached the circle, careful not to cross it. That would have been a big mistake, and one I would likely not have survived. Instead, I stood at the edge as the two of us observed each other. "Why do you let my uncle think he's trapped you?" The demon's laugh was like a stone falling to the bottom of a deep well. "What makes you believe he hasn't?" "I've been studying the circle for 5 days. I'm not as scholarly as my uncle, but I know it has some imperfections. I think you could leave if you wanted to. So why don't you?" The otherworldly creature blinked at me, and I got the feeling that it was really seeing me for the first time. "You might be smarter than the old man gives you credit for. Smart enough to know it's not a good idea to trap things you can't control." The demon sat back, grinning toothily at me. "Make sure that's a lesson you remember when you grow as old and as fat as that one." It indicated my sleeping uncle as it spoke. I let my uncle sleep, and the demon and I continued our silent vigil over the other. He would need his strength for tomorrow's show, and for what I suspected might be the biggest and brightest show of his life. They began arriving before sunset the next day. They all came whether they wanted to or not, enticed by the curiosity of his invitation. Some wore suits, some wore cloaks, but they all possessed the sort of fantastical assurance that my uncle did. It was in the way their faces pinched or their eyebrows raised when you said something they disagreed with. It was the kind of assurance that says, "Yes, yes, I know more than you, I've seen more than you, and the things that amaze you are things I see as I butter my toast every morning." They arrived in old cars and limousines. One even came in a horse-drawn carriage. But as night set upon the house, they all arrived. With the spectators in attendance, my uncle came down the grand staircase of his manor house like the belle of the ball. He was dressed in a long white cloak, stars and swirls emblazoned upon it, in a new crushed velvet suit that must have cost him more than some of the cars in front of his house. He shook hands, greeted all of them by name, and as his disciples walked around with drinks and food, he told some of them about the wonders he had under glass. Some of them were impressed, some of them simply nodded and smiled politely, treating the items on display like you might a stack of knickknacks at a garage sale. They undoubtedly had their own collection of strange antiquities, and his were nothing to write home about. No, they had come for nothing less than the show he had promised them. He let them mingle until the grandfather clock struck midnight. Then he ushered everyone down to the basement for what he promised would be the event of a lifetime. They all pressed into the small space, crowding around the curtain that Uncle Mark had hung around the circle. Some of the disciples stood around, politely advising the crowd that they not touch. When everyone was downstairs, my uncle stood before the opening and rolled his sleeves with a practiced flip. Like a magician at a child's birthday party, he pulled the curtain to reveal his grand finale. They all gasped appreciatively. A few of them screamed in fear, but they all looked at my uncle a little differently when they saw the demon he had trapped in the circle. I would later realize that even the people he had called friends had considered him a faker. They all thought he was charismatic, a real Jim Jones type, or maybe even another Herschel Applewhite. But when it came to magic, he was a little more than a convincing performer. What they saw now convinced them that they had been wrong, and my uncle was the real deal. Immediately, the questions came. How had he done it? Where had he gotten the knowledge? How had he constructed his circle? They gathered around him like a flock of birds, their incessant questions increasing as my uncle told them that all would be explained. They wanted to see his grimoire, where they had found the name of the creature. They wanted to inspect the circle so they might duplicate it in their own environments. They wanted to inspect the demon so that they might have a better idea of his makeup. Could my uncle contain him so they could get a closer look? Could he destroy it while maintaining the body so they might inspect it further? All their questions inflated my uncle's ego, but that ego died as quickly as their questions when the lights suddenly went out. My uncle turned, trying to see if someone had bumped the lights, but when a glow rose up in the room, he knew it had been no accident. The glow came from the creature as he hunkered in the circle, and when he stood and unfurled his wings, the barrier did not repel him. Many in the crowd took a cautionary step backwards, but they were trapped in the basement, and all the space allotted would not have saved them. The demon's voice sounded huge in that small space, and every word he said will forever and indelibly be etched into my memory. Perhaps I can answer some of your burning questions, it said as it stepped over the first ring of the circle. This man has constructed no circle that will hold me. This man has constructed nothing that would hold the likes of me. This man is a charlatan, just like the rest of you. You all play at magic. That's why you call it practice. None of you can grasp an iota of the divine that is stored in my smallest finger, let alone muster the power to travel from your pitiful little dimension into mine. As he spoke, he attempted to step across the middle ring. To my surprise, and my uncle's credit, his foot stopped in the air for a count of 4. It was a minute thing, no more than an eye blink, but the ring had stopped him momentarily. As his foot came down on the other side, however, I knew that it had only been a piddling thing. The only thing he's done correctly was to call me by name, and I will give him credit where credit is due. His pronunciation of that abyssal tone was precise and enlightening. Truly, it gives me hope for your species, though not a lot. He stood between the middle and the final rings for what felt like an eternity, and I imagined that everyone in the basement was holding their breath. And why did I stay inside the circle of an underwhelming caster for so long? Well, it's quite simple. Everyone, above and below, knows of the deep insecurities and deeper pride of Marcus Pate. I can assure you, you fumbling pretenders, I wanted nothing more than to rip him apart and drink the squirt of mana that he and your little flock have. But I realized that if I stayed and made you think I was powerless, you would draw bigger fish for my dinner. Fish with more than a splash of mana. You are all pretenders, all bumbling apprentices before the power I was weaned to. But you were also, all of you, churning with stolen power, and I will feast well tonight. He stepped over the final ring, shattering whatever protection may have existed within it. The rest is, thankfully, a blur. I was nearly trampled by the crowd as it surged around me, and as they shoved me down, I felt one of the columns in the basement bang hard against my back. I ducked down, curling into a ball as the sea of people parted around me. I was pulled and pushed, but I did not get taken by that tide. I was content to sit on my rock as the river was cut by a pike, much too large to hold it. I remember the first warm spatter as it hit me. My hair was suddenly damp, and as a loud roar cut through the cacophony, I put my hands against my ears and felt my skull vibrate dully. I cowered through almost all the carnage. People fell around me, their blood making my hair and skin wet, and there always seemed to be more. The demon moved amongst them like a shadow, cutting and slicing as he came, turning them into a slurry. I felt his claws slice inches above my head more times than I could count, and when my hair wafted down around my ears, I realized how close he had actually come. The 50 or so people in the basement took forever to be shredded, though I remember it seeming to end just as quickly as it began. When the screaming and moaning had finally come to a low death, I opened my eyes and looked up to find the impossibly large demon standing before me. As I looked up into the urine-colored eyes, I saw my short life pass before my own eyes and was not impressed with the journey. I could feel his acrid exhalation on my face as he knelt to my level. It smelled like hell itself. "I have decided not to kill you, little one. I want you to remember 2 things as you go about your long and eventful life. The first is that your spark of mana is greater than your uncle could have ever dreamed, though you will need to tend it to grow it to its full potential. The second," and as his wet, squashed nose bumped mine, I almost shrieked in fear. "The second is that demons are not the playthings of the magically stunted. Tell them that my kind are not to be trifled with, and the next time one of you apes feels like you can stand on even footing with a demon, I will do much worse than this." He touched the column I was cowering against, and as the flames licked down it, I glanced up and saw them sprouting to the ceiling as well. "This house will be ashes in less than an hour. If you want to live, I suggest you not be in it." I felt myself rising, little as I wanted to, and climbing the stairs as I walked from my uncle's house. They told me later that I had burns on my feet, similar to walking through a bed of cooling ashes, but I didn't feel them while they were happening. I walked out of the house like someone in a dream, standing in the courtyard of Uncle Mark's palatial house as the flames consumed it. I stood there until the twinkling lights of the fire trucks came into view, and the men in the fire coats led me to the ambulance. My uncle's closest neighbor was 2 miles away, but they had apparently smelled the smoke and seen the blaze from their bedroom windows. I went to live with my aunt again after that. She worked mostly from home now, her job more relaxed than it had been. My aunt moved us here to Kashmir for a job with the local paper, and that's how I came to be sitting on your couch, Miss Winters. Some parts of my childhood are foggy. I've forgotten a lot of the things my uncle taught me, but many of the more practical things have wormed their way into my daily life. My teachers are trying to push me into a career in anthropology and antiquities, like my uncle. I think my knowledge of languages and certain old world customs would be beneficial to me in those fields, but I don't know if I want to invite those kinds of feelings in again. What if I become as bad as my uncle was? What if I fall into the same trap that snared him? What if next time I'm the one looking at the rabbit cage and thinking, will it hold a tiger? The young man looked on the verge of pushing the lump from his throat, and Winter hoped he wouldn't choke when she suddenly brought his teeth back together with a gentle hand. He gagged a little, his throat bulging as he swallowed his memory again. The cup spilled from his hand, and he looked at her in bewilderment as she stared back at him evenly. What did you do that for?" he asked, tears leaking from his eyes. She could tell that he wanted to be rid of this memory, had been rid of it for a wonderful moment, only to find that it would be with him forever. "I won't take this memory. I'll tell Juliet to tear up your paperwork. Don't come here again, Mr. Pate. I won't take this memory from you." Winter turned, and when he grabbed her arm, she turned back to give him the full brunt of her stare. "Why not? I need this gone. I don't want this terrible knowledge to—" But he stopped when he looked into her eyes. She wondered what he saw there. She wondered if it seemed familiar. "Touch me again, and I will teach you a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Go, take your knowledge, and serve your purpose. Study old bones and other people's leavings, who were much wiser than you, and spread your truth to those who decide they are wise." He tried to let her go, and when she grabbed his arm and pulled him close, she saw the cowering boy he had once been. "Demons are not your playthings, and you would do well to remember it." He nodded, his head flopping a little as he wobbled his acceptance, and when she let him go, he knocked his chair over as he scuttled from the room. Pamela reflected that she could have used the money from that session, but the lesson was one that needed to be taught. She knew creatures that would thank her for not scrubbing one such as him, even if he wouldn't.